Chapter 25:18. For the former fifth senior brother, the first layer of the mainland was already an extremely strong shackle. It was this shackle that limited his cultivation realm to the innate grand luo realm, and he could not break through it for hundreds of millions of years. If he were to encounter the fate of being expelled from this continent, he would definitely be overjoyed. He would probably be overjoyed even if he were to give up all the achievements he had made on this continent in the past hundreds of millions of years. However, it was obvious that this was only for the former fifth senior brother. As for Taoist Yuan Zheng, he felt extremely helpless about this. After all, Taoist Yuan Zheng's situation was completely different from that of the former fifth senior brother. Compared to the former fifth senior brother, who was restricted, Taoist Yuan Zheng did not owe the world any karma. On the contrary, the world owed him a deep karma. This also meant that he should have been able to obtain great benefits from this world. But now the heavens and the earth wanted to renege on the benefits that were supposed to be given to him, and it wanted to turn everything he'd done into bubbles. How could he accept this? When others owe you karma, you hold on to it tightly and never let it go. You owe others karma, but you want to drive them away. Taoist Yuan Zheng felt helpless for some reason. Fortunately, this continent didn't push him too far, although there was a considerable repulsive force acting on him. Although there was a strong repulsive force on him, it did not use its full strength to drive him away from this mainland. Instead, it only expressed its will. If he wanted to stay here, he would eventually be able to do so. After so many years of development, although this land of loathing spirits in the northwest did not become a holy land for cultivation, it was already comparable to other ordinary areas. Therefore, the northwest corner of this mainland had unknowingly gathered a large number of intelligent living beings to live here. Although this mainland was vast and boundless, with almost infinite space for living beings to live in. However, the increase in the number of living beings was infinite. Even if it was infinite space, it would not be enough for living beings to survive over the long years. That was why this place, which was originally a place of loathing spirits, had turned into an ordinary area. For the living beings that were constantly growing, it was a new place to go. When they could not find a better place to develop, they would naturally come here. Intelligent living beings naturally had their own pursuits. The land of spirit loathing did not have any extraordinary powers, so it did not matter to ordinary beings. However, for intelligent beings, that was a place that they absolutely detested. If this land of loathing spirits hadn't become normal, intelligent beings definitely wouldn't have settled here. Therefore, by now, there were already hundreds of billions of intelligent living beings that relied on Taoist Yuan Zheng to survive. It could be said that if Taoist Yuan Zheng left, this place would once again turn into a land of loathing spirits. When that time came, the billions of intelligent creatures that remained here would probably die in large numbers. In this way, the karma that Taoist Yuan Zheng owed to the heaven and earth over the past few days would be wiped away unknowingly. Perhaps this was one of the important reasons why this world did not immediately chase Taoist Yuan Zheng away. If it was an ordinary cultivator at the level of Taoist Yuan Zheng, who was only one step away from attaining the false saint realm, he could only stay here and not be able to get away. However, it was obvious that Taoist Yuan Zheng was not an ordinary cultivator. His original body was a fifth tribulation expert. His experience, knowledge, and realm far surpassed the level of a false saint. With such a foundation, he had countless ways to get out of this awkward predicament. However, if I do it, won't the karma be even greater? In that case, it might be enough for me to become a false saint with the help of this first layer of the continent. Taoist Yuan Zheng thought. The land of spirit loathing was quite vast. After all, it was an area that could accommodate hundreds of billions of intelligent living beings. Compared to the entire continent, this was a small area that was not worth mentioning, but in fact, it had a great connection with the continent as a whole. If Taoist Yuan Zheng could reverse the characteristics of this area's spirit loathing, it would be equivalent to expanding the living space of the cultivators on this continent. This was almost equivalent to the growth of this continent. It was clear that this was a rather significant karma. With such a decision, Taoist Yuan Zheng began to take action. With a slight thought, rays of spiritual light emerged from his body and outlined mysterious runes one after another in the void. These runes were extremely mysterious and wonderful. They kept piling up densely in the void and vaguely constructed pieces of space-time. As they gradually converged, they formed an indescribably complex system, causing the void around his body to unknowingly become dotted with stars. These stars kept shining, and the rules of the universe were gradually derived and connected with each other. Wisps of the world's essence began to be born in these space-time and circulated along the connections of those space-time, gradually forming a sustainable system. Immediately after, Taoist Yuan Zheng let out a soft shout, and endless spiritual light poured into the space-time constructed by countless runes. In an instant, these runes and space-time completely solidified, as if they had become the natural landscape of this continent, and could no longer be shaken. Following this change, Taoist Yuan Zheng's body trembled, and an indescribable feeling of fatigue emerged. It's really quite difficult. This continent is really extraordinary. After a long time, he sighed. At this time, his complexion had recovered, but there was still unconcealable fatigue in his eyes. Evidently, he seemed to have recovered on the surface, but the loss in his essence was still there. Creating a world was a simple matter for existences who had reached the innate zenith heaven realm. For Taoist Yuan Zheng, who was already at the peak of the false saint realm and was only a step away from becoming a false saint, creating a world was extremely easy. If it was simply to create a world to provide endless energy and materials for this continent, it would naturally be extremely easy for him. However, this seemingly perfect solution was, in fact, extremely unfeasible. The reason was none other than the uniqueness of this continent. This continent was part of the 999 floors of the High Tower continent, and it had an extremely close and subtle connection with the other 999 floors of the High Tower continent. This close connection made this continent extremely stable, and it could even withstand the battle of tribulation powerhouses and existences of higher levels. However, at the same time, it also caused any changes to this continent to cause a huge chain reaction, which could eventually change the entire 999 floors of the High Tower continent. For example, if Taoist Yuan Zheng were to create a world to replace the normal state of the land of spiritual loathing by constantly releasing energy and materials to maintain the normal state of the land of spiritual loathing, the appearance of this world would definitely cause a chain reaction in the 999 floors of the High Tower continent. Such a chain reaction would definitely cause a backlash from the land of spiritual loathing with 999 floors of the High Tower continent. If such a backlash were to spread, the world created by Taoist Yuan Zheng would probably not be able to last more than a few days before it completely collapsed. However, what was the point of a world that could only last for a few days to this land of spiritual loathing? Therefore, it was obviously impossible to replace himself with such a simple method. After all, there was no problem with Taoist Yuan Zheng using himself as a medium to release the energy and materials, because he was using the karma between himself and this continent to withstand the backlash. If one were to trace back to the past, it was this continent that had withstood the backlash released by the land of spiritual loathing that prevented him and his inner world from collapsing and perishing under such circumstances. Without Taoist Yuan Zheng as a medium, the karma of the backlash would naturally cease to exist. Precisely because of this, Taoist Yuan Zheng had to use other methods to solve the problem of the land of spiritual loathing after he left. What Taoist Yuan Zheng did at this time was to bypass the backlash he suffered when he created his own world. Instead, he directly relied on the time, space, rules, and even material energy of this continent to create a formation that could generate energy and life on its own, similar to the formation of a world. Through this wonderful formation, he could continuously produce energy and materials to maintain the normal state of the land of spiritual loathing. Such a method was naturally not easy, and it was not something that could be done by an ordinary pseudo-saint. The advantage of this method was that the land of spiritual loathing would bear the backlash of the land of spiritual loathing entirely. In this case, the formation would be able to exist for a long time, and the energy and materials could be produced for a long time to maintain the current state of the land of spiritual loathing. As the formation was formed, Taoist Yuan Zheng slowly stopped releasing energy and materials from his inner world. When he completely closed his inner world, he felt his body tremble slightly, as if he had suddenly let go of a weight that weighed hundreds of millions of tons on him. Immediately after, he could not help but be pulled into the karma perspective. From this perspective, he saw that the karma connection between himself and the entire continent began to deepen crazily. Moreover, he could faintly see that he wasn't just connected to this continent, but he was also connected to the other 999 continents that were hidden behind this continent. However, this connection did not have any effect on him. On the contrary, it pulled him and sent him to a higher realm. Is this because I can't cut off this connection, even if I'm chased away? Taoist Yuan Zheng had an inexplicable guess in his heart. Amidst this speculation, he slightly relaxed himself. His cultivation realm suddenly broke through a subtle barrier, and he directly entered the realm that he was extremely familiar with, the pseudo-saint realm. His mind, his body, his energy, his might, the space-time in his body, the world in his body, and everything else instantly fused with the land of spiritual loathing. A feeling of being omniscient, omnipotent, eternal, and indestructible in this area arose spontaneously. In an instant, he understood that he had broken through the pseudo-saint realm and become a pseudo-saint. The moment he achieved this, he felt that the karma between himself and this continent began to decrease rapidly. The karma connection that was originally like auspicious clouds covering the sky was completely cut off in just a short moment, leaving only a vague outline that was still faintly discernible. I've finally succeeded. Taoist Yuan Zheng let out a long sigh of relief. At this moment, the entire first layer of the continent no longer had any secrets in his heart. The path to the second layer was unprecedentedly clear to him. He could even understand the test and the difficult problems within a glance. He had absolute confidence that he would be able to break through the path and enter the second layer without passing the test or solving the difficult problems. However, he knew that this was just an illusion. Before he could transcend this first layer of the continent and break through to the next realm so that his pseudo-saint realm would no longer be shackled by the space-time that he had entrusted himself to, he would not be able to leave this first layer and enter the second layer of the continent. Although entrusting himself to the space-time of the first layer allowed him to break through to the next realm, at the same time, it also added a barrier and a layer of shackles to him. With regards to this, Taoist Yuan Zheng's mind raced, and he was very clear about it. However, even so, he did not feel discouraged or any negative emotions because of this. Instead, he felt relieved. Transcending the shackles of heaven and earth and becoming a pseudo-saint without being shackled was an indescribable transformation for ordinary people. However, to him, it was just a small step that couldn't be more simple. It couldn't even be considered a barrier. In this case, why would he need to worry about this? In the center of the forbidden area, Luo Fan's eyes were rather bright at this moment. It seems that he has already found a way out. Everything that happened on the continent of the 999-story tower seemed to have happened right in front of his eyes. Naturally, he saw Taoist Yuan Zheng's performance very clearly. He was quite satisfied with his performance of opening up a feasible path in an impossible situation. From a certain point of view, it could be said that he was lucky to find Taoist Yuan Zheng this time. After all, not every fifth tribulation powerhouse could be as calm as Taoist Yuan Zheng. Most fifth tribulation powerhouses should be like the previous generation's fifth senior brother. They would first wholeheartedly improve their realm, and when they realized that something was wrong, it was already too late to turn back. They could only use the long years to make up for their previous mistakes. Chapter 25:19. After a few days in the outside world, hundreds of millions of years had passed in the first floor of the 999-floored pagoda. On this day, a long laugh resounded from the northwest corner of the pagoda, and it shook the entire pagoda. Every living being on the entire pagoda could clearly sense the shaking that came from the quintessence of life, and all of them were surprised and bewildered. Is it done? In a country that was extremely harmonious, prosperous, and full of vitality that seemed to have boundless potential for development, the former fifth senior brother sighed. His eyes were filled with envy and bitterness. Although it had been hundreds of millions of years, he was still a connate, grand immortal realm cultivator. Compared to the past, there was practically no difference at all. Soon, I'll be able to sever all my karma very soon. Then, he closed his eyes and thought to himself. Presently, the vast country he built occupied around a tenth of the entire first level of the pagoda. Vaguely, it could already be compared to the many sects and sects passed down by the Tao ancestor. As a connate, grand immortal realm cultivator, one had to admit that the former fifth senior brother was rather brilliant for being able to achieve this on this continent where the strongest expert was at the pseudo-saint realm. Of course, although the former fifth senior brother's strength was only at the connate grand immortal realm, it did not mean that the strongest expert in this country was only at the connate grand immortal realm. In fact, even if his strength was insufficient, he had already won over many pseudo-saint realm existences to serve him, and they became the strength of the country. It was precisely because there were so many experts that this country was able to prosper and grow to its current state, moving the entire continent. As for how to win them over, it was an extremely complicated process. However, even the emperors of the mortal world could make experts that were far stronger than them serve them. As someone who possessed the cultivation memories of a fifth tribulation expert, it was naturally easier for the former fifth senior brother to win over those experts. Yet now, the karma between him and this continent had been reduced by 5 to 6 cities. Although it had not been completely reduced, he had already seen hope. While he was feeling complicated in his heart, a subordinate came to report to him and asked how he should deal with the phenomenon. The former fifth senior brother came back to his senses and casually explained, "This is a cultivator breaking through the realm. Don't pay attention to it." Hearing his explanation, the subordinate who came to report clearly relaxed. Clearly, even though his strength was lacking, his knowledge had convinced many of his subordinates. Even if his subordinates were at a higher cultivation level than him, they all respected him. As his explanation was passed down, the country quickly regained its peace. In the northwest corner of this continent, Taoist Yuan Zheng hung high in the sky. His entire body was transparent. His cultivation realm was still at the false saint realm, but he had already broken away from the shackles of the outside world. From now on, he could travel freely to the various realms, and his realm would no longer regress. Although he was many times weaker than his original body, it was still at the initial stage of cultivation. Taoist Yuan Zheng felt an indescribable satisfaction in his heart. The trembling of heaven and earth gradually subsided, and Taoist Yuan Zheng's mind also gradually regained its composure. He carefully examined his body and could not help but sigh inwardly. He had solved the problem of the land of loathing spirits in the northwest corner of this continent, which was equivalent to greatly expanding this continent and greatly extending the living space of this continent. If this was in other places, it would be enough to make him the son of this continent. However, here, such merit was only enough for him to entrust time and space for a while before it was exhausted. At this moment, the karmic connection between him and this continent had been completely severed. There wasn't even a trace of it left in the world. After sighing with emotion for a while, he lifted his feet and took a light step forward. In a flash, he had already crossed over half of the continent and directly arrived in front of the former fifth senior brother's palace. Congratulations on escaping, fellow Taoist. The former fifth senior brother was not surprised by Taoist Yuan Zheng's arrival. At this moment, he only bowed and said. Taoist Yuan Zheng smiled and said, "I'm just a step ahead of you. You'll catch up soon. The former fifth senior brother only smiled bitterly. It was as if he thought that he would soon be able to completely sever all the karmic connections and make further breakthroughs. However, this speed was based on the concept of time of a fifth tribulation powerhouse. According to his calculations, it was impossible for him to reach this step without billions of years or even tens of billions of years. Moreover, even if he could reach this step, he would only be able to break through to the innate zenith heaven realm. After that, he would not encounter any bottlenecks until he reached the false saint realm and could break through at will. However, the false saint realm was another huge threshold. He needed to make the world owe him karmic connections again so that he could entrust himself to this continent without being tainted by karmic connections. That would be another huge project. Taoist Yuan Zheng naturally knew about the problem that the former fifth senior brother faced. However, it was actually not difficult for him, who had already solved such a problem once. Hence, he did not treat it as a difficult task. At this moment, he only said to the former fifth senior brother, "This continent is already meaningless to me, but I'm going down. I've come this time to bid farewell to you, fellow Taoist." As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed. A speck of spiritual light appeared and was sent to the former fifth senior brother. After experiencing the karmic exchange with this continent, Taoist Yuan Zheng was even more concerned about karmic connections. When he first stepped onto this continent, the former fifth senior brother helped him a little, which could be considered as forming karmic connections with him. Now that he was leaving, he planned to return this karmic connection. The former fifth senior brother naturally knew what Taoist Yuan Zheng meant, but he did not reject his good intentions. He thanked him and took the ball of spiritual light. In an instant, a large amount of information unfolded in front of his eyes. It was the general experience that Taoist Yuan Zheng had after stepping onto this continent. Among them, it contained another method of forming karmic connections with the world, which was different from what he had done. Looking at these experiences, the former fifth senior brother felt that he had gained a lot, and a new idea faintly formed in his heart. There is more than one method of forming karmic connections with this continent. Changing the entire continent from the consciousness level and increasing its potential was one method. Taoist Yuan Zheng changing the condition of this continent from the material level and extending the void of this continent was another method. Apart from that, there were many other ways to solve this problem. Although Taoist Yuan Zheng's experiences only described one method, it had already opened up the former fifth senior brother's mind, giving him a surge of inspiration and making him restless. Looking at the former fifth senior brother's ever-changing qi dynamic, Taoist Yuan Zheng smiled and took his leave. With a slight thought, he had already arrived at the passage between the first and second layer of the continent. This was because the karmic connection between him and this continent had been completely severed. Therefore, the situation where he could leave this continent without going through any tests was naturally impossible. Now that he wanted to leave the first layer of the continent, he could only follow the outsider's method and accept the test of the passage. So the one who broke through just now is you, Taoist. At this moment, a voice suddenly entered Taoist Yuan Zheng's ears. Taoist Yuan Zheng was slightly stunned. He gathered his senses and discovered a cave abode hidden in the void, not far away. This cave abode was slowly traversing the void and gradually appearing in reality. The person who spoke was obviously the owner of the cave abode. Subsequently, a pseudo-saint walked out of the cave abode that was gradually becoming real. This pseudo-saint looked like a young man. His body was full of vitality, as if he was really a 13 or 14-year-old young man. After this young pseudo-saint appeared, he bowed to Taoist Yuan Zheng and said, "I'm Yuze. Greetings, Taoist." Taoist Yuan Zheng smiled and returned the greeting. He also introduced himself. Then he asked the pseudo-saint Yuze why he cared about his breakthrough just now. After all, in his opinion, no matter what, he had only obtained a breakthrough in the pseudo-saint stage. To an existence who was originally a fifth tribulation powerhouse, he was just like an ant. What was there to pay attention to when he had grown a little bigger? The pseudo-Saint Uze in front of him was obviously a fifth tribulation powerhouse from the outside. He looked like a pseudo-saint, but it was as if he was being suppressed by the 999 levels of the continent. The pseudo-Saint Uze smiled and said, "You might not know this, Taoist. Although I don't know why you're like this. Given your current state, you've already been recognized as an indigenous cultivator by the continent of the Tall Tower. The rule of this continent is that the strongest indigenous cultivator is the pinnacle of the strength of the outsiders. Therefore, it's because of your breakthrough that the continent's suppression on our realms has been relaxed. That's why we're able to recover our pseudo-saint cultivation." Hearing this, Taoist Yuan Zheng came to a sudden realization. He had heard a lot of news about the land of opportunity, but he had not entered the forbidden area after all. Hence, he had never heard of the details of the suppression rule before. He only understood this rule after hearing about it this time. At the same time, he also vaguely understood why he would be affected by the karma. It turned out that the reason was that he was fundamentally different from the other outsiders who were pursuing the final opportunity. However, he soon smiled bitterly. He should have known this a long time ago. After all, he couldn't find a way to leave this continent of the 999 levels of the Tall Tower at all. As for the other outsiders, it was said that they could leave this continent of the Tall Tower with just a single thought. Although they wouldn't be able to re-enter after leaving, they would still be able to leave after all. "Why are you staying here, Taoist? Is the level too difficult?" He calmed himself down and asked the pseudo-Saint Uze. Hearing this, the pseudo-Saint Uze smiled and said, "That's not the case. I just want to meet you." The pseudo-Saint Uze had entered the first level of the continent in the past hundreds of millions of years. In other words, he had only entered after Taoist Yuan Zheng had appeared on this continent. Therefore, he was rather curious about Taoist Yuan Zheng, who had entered this continent a few hours earlier than him, even though he did not see him. "I'm just an ordinary cultivator. What's there to meet?" Taoist Yuan Zheng said with a bitter smile. "The fact that you were chosen by the ruler of the Forbidden Land means that you're extraordinary. Why do you have to belittle yourself?" The pseudo-Saint Uze said with a smile. The two of them conversed like this at the entrance for several days and felt that they were rather congenial. The pseudo-Saint Uze wanted to explore the next 999 levels of the continent with Taoist Yuan Zheng. However, although Taoist Yuan Zheng was rather tempted, he still rejected him in the end. This was naturally not because he didn't feel happy exploring with the pseudo-Saint Uze, but because he clearly knew that his path was different from the pseudo-Saint Uze's. To the pseudo-Saint Uze, his goal was to keep going down and pursue the final opportunity. However, to Taoist Yuan Zheng, his goal was to complete the goal of the ruler of the Forbidden Land, escape and regain his freedom. Gathering together with such completely different goals would only delay each other. There was no way for them to make up for each other's shortcomings or help each other. After hearing his explanation, the pseudo-Saint Uze couldn't help but sigh and give up on this idea. However, although he gave up on this idea, they could still explore the passage leading to the second level together. Immediately, after the two of them came to an agreement, they smiled at each other and rushed into the entrance of the passage together. Thousands of years later, at the entrance of the second level of the continent of the Tall Tower, two disheveled figures appeared out of thin air, causing the surrounding void to distort indescribably. Is there really someone who can pass such a test? One of the figures roared angrily. This test is indeed a little difficult. The other figure seemed a little weak, as if all of his strength and spirit had been exhausted in the passage earlier. These two people were naturally the two cultivators, pseudo-Saint Uze and Taoist Yuan Zheng. The reason why they were like this was because the test they had accepted in the passage had completely subverted their understanding of the test. It was so difficult that if it wasn't for the fact that they were originally fifth tribulation powerhouses and the techniques they could use after becoming pseudo-saints were thousands of times more than before, they might have already been defeated. After a long time, the two of them slowly calmed down. With a sweep of their powers, the disheveled look on their bodies was swept away, and they completely returned to their original unfathomable state before they stepped into the passage. The two of you should be exploring the passage together, right? At this moment, a gloating voice entered their ears. Chapter 25:20. Judging from the flow of time on the outside, the mainland of the 999-story pagoda had already been established for tens of millions of years. In addition to the time distortion in the first few hundred floors of the mainland, the time it had been established was tens of thousands of times longer than this. After such a long period of development, the entrances and exits of the various floors of the mainland of the 999-story pagoda had already established a rather complicated and perfect social system. Even at the entrance of the first floor of the mainland, there was actually a rather complicated social system. It was just that the cultivation realm of Taoist Yuanzheng and fake Saint Yuzhe was too high compared to the cultivators on the first floor of the mainland, so the complicated social system did not seem to exist for them. After all, the first floor of the mainland was only the first floor. After hundreds of millions of years, there were only a few outsiders left on the first floor of the mainland. At the entrance of the tunnel, only fake Saint Yuzhe and Taoist Yuanzheng were left. Under such circumstances, the strongest person in the social system at the entrance of the tunnel was only a pseudo-saint. Compared to them, the difference was huge. However, the situation was different on the second floor of the mainland. On the second floor of the mainland, the strongest person in the mainland had already been raised to the pseudo-saint stage. Therefore, there were many pseudo-saints among the native cultivators. The level of the social system at the entrance naturally involved the pseudo-saint stage. And this was already similar to the level of Taoist Yuanzheng and fake Saint Yuzhe. In this way, the social system could not be said to be non-existent for them. At this moment, it was obvious that the cultivators guarding the entrance of the tunnel had discovered the two of them. Taoist Yuanzheng and fake Saint Yuzhe were obviously not ordinary cultivators, so they had also inquired about the situation here. At this moment, their hearts skipped a beat, and they already understood what was going on. Immediately, Taoist Yuanzheng asked curiously, "Fellow Taoist, why do you say that? Is there a problem if we go through the tunnel together?" At this moment, a middle-aged man appeared from the palace. Looking at the two of them, he seemed rather speechless. "The two of you actually dared to go through the tunnel without even finding out about this? You must know that this is common sense." "I'd like to hear the details," fake Saint Yuzhe said helplessly at this moment. The middle-aged cultivator sighed again and said, "The trial of this passage is determined by the strength of the adventurers. If the two of you go, it will be equivalent to the sum of your strength to calculate the difficulty. Furthermore, this difficulty was borne by each of you separately. Under such circumstances, you're already very lucky to have survived." As he spoke, his eyes flashed with a hint of admiration. Although he was a bit speechless at their reckless decision, the middle-aged cultivator still admired their strength. After all, when the difficulty of two people was added to one person's, the difficulty was not just doubled, it was increased by 10 or even 100 times. At the false sage level, any small increase in realm would bring about a leap in strength. Moreover, now that the strength of two pseudo-saints was stacked together, it went without saying how great the increase would be. Under such circumstances, the two of them were able to pass the test in such a sorry state. The strength of the two of them had simply surpassed their own cultivation realm. How could he not feel admiration for them? All of a sudden, a woman's voice came from the side. "Fellow Taoists, you want to go the next level as soon as possible, right? We have a guide to the next level here. I wonder if the two of you are interested?" Then, another hall appeared in the void. The middle-aged man's expression changed slightly when he heard that. The reason why he talked to Taoist Yuanzheng and fake Saint Yuzhe previously was to do business with them. Now that he had laid the groundwork, someone actually came out to stop him. This was simply outrageous. "Fellow Taoist, isn't this against the rules?" he said with a rather gloomy expression. At this moment, the figure of a woman appeared from the hall that had just appeared. She looked at the middle-aged man and said disdainfully, "How is this against the rules? You haven't really made contact with them yet. Why haven't I spoken to them? The rule here is that whoever speaks to them first will have the priority. Fellow Taoist, do you want to have a fight? The middle-aged man sneered. You haven't even told them your name, so how are you considered to have spoken to them? The woman smiled sweetly. Then, she turned to Taoist Yuan Zheng and fake Saint Yuze and said, I'm Xian. Greetings, fellow Taoists. The middle-aged man's expression changed drastically. Everyone knew that the woman was trying to stop him, and everyone knew that it wasn't right. However, he really had no reason to refute what she said. Without announcing his name, the other party didn't even know who he was, so how could he be certain that he would only do business with him? Is there any meaning in playing this kind of word game? The middle-aged man frowned. What word game? Rules are rules. Are you saying that what's beneficial to you is a rule, and what's not beneficial to you is a word game? Aren't you saying the opposite as well? Xian, he said indifferently. Hearing this, the middle-aged man was furious. As the power in his body surged, the surrounding void seemed to instantly produce all sorts of terrifying distortions. It was as if there was an endless amount of terrifying power being compressed around his body that could erupt at any time. However, Xian, he didn't panic. Seeing this, she only sneered, and spiritual light shone from her body. Similarly, there was a terrifying power surging around her that could erupt at any time. Seeing this, the two of them were about to fight. At this moment, a wave of power descended from the sky and instantly swept through this void, causing all the distortions in this void to be completely smoothed out. At a glance, there were no longer any changes. Then a voice sounded. This time, Fairy Xian, you will be receiving you. As the voice spoke, the power disappeared and everything returned to normal as if nothing had happened. The expression on the middle-aged man's face kept changing. In the end, he snorted and bowed to Taoist Yuan Zheng and fake Saint Yuze. Then, he flicked his sleeves and entered his palace. The palace gradually disappeared into the void. Oomph. You want to fight with me? Fairy Xian, he snorted. Fake Saint Yuze and Taoist Yuan Zheng didn't speak when the two of them were fighting. They just looked at them quietly. After all, they had no idea what the two of them were fighting for. They also didn't know what rules there were in this society. If they were to participate, they might have broken some taboos without even knowing. Anyway, the middle-aged man had nothing to do with them. At most, they would just say a few words to him. Naturally, they wouldn't cause trouble for themselves because of him. After Fairy Xian, he snorted. She turned around, and her expression became extremely gentle. She smiled and said, I've made a fool of myself in front of the two of you. Taoist Yuan Zheng shook his head and said, It's not that. It's just that we don't know what happened just now. Is there a need for the two of you to fight so much just to receive us? We don't seem to have any benefits to give to the two of you. Fairy Xian said, The value of the two of you is countless times higher than you think. This isn't the place to talk. How about the two of you enter my palace? Taoist Yuan Zheng and fake Saint Yuze naturally didn't care about this. When they heard this, they nodded and agreed. Then, Fairy Xian, he led the two of them into the palace behind her. After the three of them entered the palace slowly disappeared. In the end, it became invisible as if it had never existed. Peace returned to the entrance of the passageway. The palace looked like a simple and unadorned palace from the outside. However, when they entered, it was an extremely vast space-time. So, with a native living being, fake Saint Yuze and Taoist Yuan Zheng entered the palace. After seeing the space-time, they understood. Although the space-time was vast and boundless, they could see traces of the vast continent outside. At a glance, although it didn't look similar to the continent of the tall pagoda, the various details and key points inside were the same origin as the continent of the tall pagoda. They were inseparable. However, all of this was not compatible with Fairy Xian Yi's own cultivation path. The two of them could clearly see that Fairy Xian had obviously put in a lot of effort to make this space-time compatible with her cultivation path. She had made many changes to this space-time. In fact, it was these changes that made this space-time different from the continent outside. It no longer looked like the continent outside. However, The fundamental incompatibility couldn't be completely reversed no matter how much she changed it on the surface. Therefore, incompatibility was still incompatibility in the end. With one look, it was obvious that this was due to Fairy Xian's lack of knowledge. Or perhaps it was because Fairy Xian had only seen the continent of the tall pagoda and only seen the structure of this world. Therefore, her knowledge was simply blinded by this world, and she didn't know that there were other forms of heaven and earth. With such a restriction, Fairy Xian's origin was obvious at a glance. If she was an outsider and a Phi Tribulation expert, she would have to monitor billions of kinds of structures of heaven and earth and billions of kinds of space-time structures on the Tao Master Path alone. With so many worlds and so many kinds of space-time structures, no matter how bad her luck was, she would definitely be able to find a form that was similar to her cultivation path. With a slight change, she would naturally be able to completely match her cultivation path. By then, whether she cultivated or lived in this space-time, it would be countless times better than it was now. Obviously, the structure of this space-time indicated that she didn't have such knowledge. Therefore, she could only be a native cultivator. However, although they knew that Fairy Xian was a native cultivator, neither Taoist Yuan Zheng nor fake Saint Yuze looked down on Fairy Xian because of this. The 999-story continent of the Tall Pagoda had already given these native cultivators the opportunity to catch up to them. As long as any native cultivator was willing to work hard and seize enough opportunities, they would eventually be able to stand on the same level as them one day. Under such circumstances, what was the difference between looking down on them and looking down on oneself? Fairy Xian knew that her identity had been seen through by Taoist Yuan Zheng and fake Saint Yuze when she saw their expressions. At that moment, a greater sense of hope welled up in her heart. Perhaps I can really succeed this time, she thought to herself. The reason why only one cultivator would pass through the entrance of the passageway every 10 million or even hundreds of millions of years, yet they still remained here and even formed a complete social system with strict rules, was naturally not just because of the strategy that Fairy Xian had mentioned to Taoist Yuan Zheng and the others. How valuable was this strategy to them, who were fake saints? Was it worth it for them to waste immeasurable time waiting here aimlessly? How was it worth it for Fairy Xian and her fellow Taoist cultivators to fight for the right to trade? In fact, to these cultivators, the most important and valuable thing for them to pass through the passage was none other than their knowledge. It was the knowledge related to heaven and earth, the knowledge related to cultivation, and the knowledge related to Tao. It was this irreplaceable knowledge that all native cultivators couldn't obtain that was enough for them to waste time here and for them to fall out with each other and fight over it. Fellow Taoist, you must have noticed that my space-time is not compatible with my Tao of cultivation. After sitting down in an extremely beautiful fairyland, Fairy Xian said to Taoist Yuan Zheng and fake Saint Yuze. Taoist Yuan Zheng's heart skipped a beat. He vaguely had a feeling that the opportunity for him to advance to the tribulation stage might lie in what Fairy Xian was going to say next. To Taoist Yuan Zheng, improving his Tao realm and working hard to restore his peak strength were his most important goals in this 999-story high tower continent. In comparison, heading to the final place of opportunity was just something that he could do in passing. Under such circumstances, the so-called strategy to advance to a deeper level was not essential to him. If Fairy Xian had only taken out this dispensable strategy to trade with him, he might have agreed to it for the sake of convenience. However, he would definitely feel that it was a waste of time. Chapter 25-21. Although Taoist Yuan Zheng had a lot of inspirations in his heart and felt like he had opened the door to a whole new world, he still wasn't completely sure about it. Therefore, he only looked at Fairy Xian with a hint of expectation and inquiry in his eyes. He was looking forward to what Fairy Xian was going to say next, and he wanted to find out the source of what she was going to say. Fairy Xian didn't stop. When she saw Taoist Yuan Zheng nodding in agreement with her words, she continued. On the surface, This incompatibility seems to only make the space-time I live in uncomfortable. But in fact, it means that I've reached a bottleneck in my knowledge. As time goes by, this bottleneck will become more and more difficult to break through, and eventually I won't be able to shake it at all. Taoist Yuan Zheng felt that the vague ideas in his heart had become clearer. At this moment, Fairy XNE continued, "So what I want this time is a world framework that fits my cultivation path. As long as fellow Taoist is willing to give me this world framework, I'm willing to give you everything I have." As a native cultivator, although Fairy XIN had stayed on the second floor, in fact, her understanding of the entire 999 floors of the pagoda was not limited to the second floor. In fact, she was very clear about the situation of almost every layer of the continent. In fact, she was very clear about the method to pass through each level to reach the next level. If he could obtain this information, Taoist Yuan Zheng would be able to reach all the way from this floor to the last floor in just a few days, as long as he was willing to. The benefits were so great that it went without saying. Although Taoist Yuan Zheng wasn't sure about this, he knew that as a native cultivator, Fairy XAN, he would definitely be very useful to him. She would definitely have many things that would be useful to him. Furthermore, apart from that, Fairy XNE's request had already allowed him to see a path to the heavens and filled him with hope for the future. Just this point alone was enough for him to exchange for the world framework. After all, the world framework was no different from any other cultivation comprehension to him. He only needed to reproduce the world framework of a certain world that he had seen in the past. Immediately, a faint smile appeared on Taoist Yuan Zheng's face. He said, "I only need one thing, and that is all the methods you know to pass the test of the passage." Goddess Xin, he was pleasantly surprised. The meaning of these words was clearly that he had already agreed. Perhaps for Taoist Yuan Zheng, the structure of that world was nothing special. It was not even considered loss. However, it was extremely important to her. Without the framework of that world, she would not be able to break through in her path of cultivation. If she could not break through, she would forever be shackled at her current realm. This was simply an unbearable hell for her, who'd already developed the heart of a cultivator to improve herself. That was why she had directly revealed her greatest trump card and everything she had just for Taoist Yuan Zheng to choose from. Under such circumstances, how could he not be surprised and excited when he heard that Taoist Yuan Zheng had no intention of bargaining and directly agreed to her proposal? "Thank you, fellow cultivator. All these years, I've already collected all the methods to pass through the passageway. I have some understanding of each of the 998 passageways. Although not every passageway will allow you to pass through without any obstacles, it will definitely be able to reduce the time and difficulty of passing to the minimum." Goddess Xin, he said. Hearing this, False Saint Yuze's face also revealed an excited expression. He could not help but be excited. Previously, the passageway was simply hell for him. It made him feel like dying. Although it did not leave a shadow in his heart, it still made him feel a lingering fear of the difficulty of that passageway. In this case, he was naturally quite concerned about the methods that could reduce the difficulty of the passageway test and the time he had to pass through the passageway. As for whether Taoist Yuan Zheng would hand over the information to him, he was not worried at all. After all, he knew that Taoist Yuan Zheng's goal was different from his. To him, passing through the layers of continents was not his ultimate goal. This information might be extremely important to him, but it was different for Taoist Yuan Zheng himself. Under such circumstances, Taoist Yuan Zheng's exchange request to Goddess Xin was obviously made for him. In this case, why would he need to worry about this? "Show me your cultivation path first, so that I can choose the structure of the world," Taoist Yuan Zheng said to Goddess Xin immediately. Goddess Xin, he did not hesitate at all. In an instant, a beam of spiritual light gushed out from her body. With a tremble in the void, it turned into countless runes, lines, words, and all kinds of strange patterns. Among them, every rune was so complicated that it could explode the brain of an intelligent creature. Every line was enough for any creature that could see these lines clearly to have millions of words of comprehension. Every word contained endless information and endless deep meanings. As for those patterns, every one of them was incredibly mysterious. Any one of them could become a visualization pattern for an ordinary cultivator to use as the core of their cultivation. These were Goddess Xianyi's cultivation path. It contained all aspects of her path of cultivation. It even included her self-awareness, the direction of development of the path of cultivation, and the prospects of development. It could be said that if a creature without self-awareness saw this kind of seed and completely accepted it, he would definitely be able to grow to the level of Goddess Xianyi. In other words, the level of a false saint. This kind of existence should be extremely precious and was Goddess Xianyi's biggest secret. However, at this moment, she showed all of this without any reservation. It did not feel like she was showing the cultivation path. Instead, it felt like she was showing a certain scenery that she had seen before. Taoist Yuan Zheng and false Saint Jade Luster were not surprised by her decisiveness. After all, this was obviously a necessary step in order to choose a world structure that was compatible with the cultivation path. In other words, from the moment Fairy Xianyi made this request, her cultivation path had been completely revealed, and it was already destined that this would happen. Under such circumstances, how could they be surprised? At this moment, be it Taoist Yuan Zheng or false Saint Jade Luster, they were only carefully studying her cultivation path. As for why Goddess Xianyi was so decisive, apart from the fact that she had to do this to obtain a world structure that was compatible with her, more importantly, she did not think that doing so would be a loss for her. After all, an existence that could become a false saint, be it an outsider or a native cultivator, must have found their own cultivation path. He must have completely engraved this path of cultivation in the depths of his heart, engraved it in his own life source. Under such circumstances, even if they saw the cultivation path of others, they would not be able to turn it into their own, let alone change their own cultivation path into the appearance of a new cultivation path that they had seen. As for whether they would be able to see their flaws and weaknesses after knowing the cultivation path, so that it would be easier for them to fight against them in the future, there was no need to worry. The path of cultivation was not some superficial moves. To them, knowing or not knowing made no difference at all. If you want to deal with the existence of this Tao of cultivation, then you need to have a more brilliant method and strength to be able to do it. Knowing it would not help the outcome of such a battle. Even if she did not know, it would not make the battle more difficult. Under such circumstances, why should she worry that her cultivation path would be known by others? In the blink of an eye, several years passed in such a state. On a certain day, after several years, Taoist Yuan Zheng let out a long breath and said, "All right, I already know what world is compatible with your cultivation path. I didn't expect your cultivation path to be like this." It went without saying how complicated and exquisite a false saint's cultivation path was. If it was not exquisite and complicated enough, how could it support a cultivator to become a false saint? Therefore, a few hundred years was not a long time to comprehend this path of cultivation. This was the case even for a false saint who was originally a five-tribulation powerhouse who understood this cultivation path. Hearing his words, Goddess Xianyi turned to look at false Saint Jade Luster. At this moment, false Saint Jade Luster nodded and said, "That's right, you can put it away. I've also understood it." Hearing this, Goddess Xianyi's expression relaxed slightly. With a thought, the countless words, runes, lines, and light shadows all converged and turned into a ray of spiritual light. They returned to her body and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Although she had been displaying her cultivation path for hundreds of years, this was not a problem for her at all. It was not difficult at all. Throughout the entire process, she was extremely relaxed and did not show any signs of strain at all. However, at this moment, after putting away these cultivation paths, she felt a little nervous and a little uneasy. This was because her fate was to break through the bottleneck and continue to improve and advance, or to be stuck at this bottleneck forever, unable to break through and transcend. Everything depended on what Taoist Yuanzhang was going to say next. Do you want to do it? Or should I? Taoist Yuanzhang looked at false Saint Jade Luster and said with a smile, "You do it. I want to see how your techniques are." "It's different from what I thought," false Saint Jade Luster said with a smile. Hearing this, Taoist Yuanzhang did not decline anymore. He nodded and said, "Then watch carefully." As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped the void. In an instant, countless light shadows rushed out of his hand and began to outline and condense in the void in front of him. In just a few breaths, they had already turned into the phantom of a strange world. This world was extremely mysterious. Although it was just a phantom, there was an indescribable sense of heaviness everywhere. It felt as if even the air in it was heavier than the heaviest thing in reality. The specific structure of the entire world was so chaotic that it could not be described with words. It was as if the laws and principles in this world had been thrown into a washing machine and stirred for a few days and nights. The moment she saw this phantom of the world, Goddess Exan felt her body tremble. Her eyes were tightly attracted to this phantom of the world, and an extremely strong desire suddenly arose in her heart. It was a kind of desire to fuse with this phantom, to completely turn this phantom into his own. That's it. This is the world that suits me the best. It's the world that can break through my bottleneck. At this moment, she was roaring crazily in her heart. These kinds of irrepressible desires caused her face to turn red. She looked like she was ready to make a move. Taoist Yuanzhang's expression was extremely calm as he quietly looked at Goddess Xin in front of him. Only then did Goddess Xin come back to her senses. She took a deep breath and said, "Thank you, fellow Taoists. This is the method to pass the passage test between any two continents that I've collected. Please check it." As she said that, a spiritual light appeared out of thin air in front of her and began to condense rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a small ball of spiritual light brilliance. It slowly rotated in the void and trembled slightly. There seemed to be countless light shadows constantly flashing within it. It made people who looked at it feel like they could vaguely comprehend something. Faced with such a situation, Taoist Yuanzhang smiled faintly and raised his hand. The spiritual light had already arrived in front of him and landed in his hand. At the same time, the phantom of the world in his hand floated and arrived in front of Goddess Xin. At this moment, Goddess Xin couldn't help but raise her hand and grab the phantom. She pressed it smoothly into the space between her eyebrows. Obviously, she used the most appropriate method to preserve the structure of this world. Taoist Yuanzhang swept a glance at the spiritual light. The endless information contained within the spiritual light had already flowed into his heart, allowing him to instantly understand the method to pass the passage test between every two continents. For a moment, he couldn't help but want to immediately pass the test and head to the final land of opportunity below the 999th level. Of course, this was only a momentary impulse. Very quickly, he suppressed this impulse. After all, he had now completely become a native of this Hightower continent. Under such circumstances, although each continent had no restrictions on him, his own cultivation realm had instead become an obstacle for him to enter many continents. Therefore, even with the guidance of these information, it was impossible for him to reach the final land of opportunity in the end. Therefore, even with the guidance of these information, it was ultimately impossible for him to reach the final land of opportunity. Chapter 25-22. Fake Saint Yuze took the spiritual light and instantly immersed himself in it. Not long after, his face was full of smiles. Obviously, he was quite satisfied with the information contained in the spiritual light. The satisfaction of the fake Sage Jade luster meant that everyone who participated in this transaction was satisfied. This transaction could be considered to have been successfully completed. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no need for Taoist Yuanzhang and fake Saint Yuze to continue staying in Fairy Xin Yi's cave abode. Immediately, the two of them bade farewell and left. Fairy Xin was obviously happy to see them leave. Now, she couldn't wait to immediately transform her cave abode into the world composition that she had obtained from Taoist Yuanzheng. How could she still be in a mood to talk nonsense with the two of them? It could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that she still had rationality, she might have even chased them away when she saw that they were still lingering. In this way, she didn't even say a word to urge them to stay. Instead, she just respectfully sent the two of them out. After that, she directly closed the palace and disappeared into the void, beginning to complete the crucial part of her next round of cultivation. Taoist Yuan Zheng and fake Saint Yu Zhe didn't care about what happened at this passageway. At this moment, they were both heading toward the entrance of the passageway that led to the third level. Originally, Taoist Yuan Zheng and fake Saint Yu Zhe should have separated at the entrance of this level of the continent. After all, both of them had different goals. If they continued to stay together, they would be wasting each other's time and making it impossible for each other to complete their goals. It would be far better to split up. However, the situation was obviously completely different now. After obtaining the information that Fairy Xian had given them, they were already clear about every passageway that led to the next level. Under such circumstances, they didn't need to explore at all and could directly arrive at the entrance of the passageway that led to the next level. In fact, they didn't even need to waste much energy thinking about how to pass through this passageway to enter the third level. This naturally meant that fake Saint Yu Zhe didn't need to waste time on the second level at all. He could directly head to his destination. At most, he would only need to waste a few days. Obviously, to Taoist Yuan Zheng, he still had the right to waste a few days. Because of this, Taoist Yuan Zheng followed fake Saint Yu Zhe and headed towards the passageway to the third level. Most of this was to send off the fake sage Jade Pool on his final journey. The fake sage Jade Luster was well aware of this, but he didn't /T show much emotion. It wasn't like they were going to be separated by life and death here. If they really wanted to continue this kind of friendship, then they would be able to meet again in the future. But if he didn't have the heart to continue this friendship, then even if he was reluctant and moved, what was the use? With such a mentality, they did not show any reluctance or tears when they parted. Instead, they were very carefree as they said goodbye to each other and parted ways. Fake Sage Jade Luster entered the passageway leading to the third level to accept the test in the passageway. Taoist Yuan Zheng, on the other hand, headed toward the civilized area of this layer of land to try out another cultivation method he had thought of in Fairy Xian's abode. There is no need to mention fake Sage Jade Luster. With the guidance of the strategy, his advancement speed was relatively fast. He only took a few days to completely pass through the passageway that would have taken him decades or even centuries to pass through. After that, one passageway after another and one test after another, he continuously advanced toward the depths of the tall pagoda continent at a speed that almost surpassed the historical record compared to fake Sage Jade Luster / success. Taoist Yuan Zheng /'s plan was obviously not so easy. It really isn't /T that simple. In a certain cultivation city, Taoist Yuan Zheng sighed helplessly. Several hundred years had passed since he had parted ways with fake Sage Jade Luster. In these hundreds of years, apart from cultivating, he spent most of his time on the inspiration he had when he was talking to Fairy Xian. However, until now, he still couldn't /T turn that inspiration into reality. He couldn't /T really push open the door to the brand new world that he had seen when he was talking to Fairy Xian. The structure of the civilization on the second level was actually quite similar to that of the first level. There were also various sects and Tao palaces. There were also many cultivators who traveled all over the continent in order to enter the Tao palace, constantly fighting to enter it. The biggest difference between this level and the first level was that this second level did not have the memories of the previous generation's fifth senior brother that existed on the first level. It was precisely because this second level was extremely similar to the first level that Taoist Yuan Zheng quickly lost interest in exploring this second level. Hence, he finally chose to stay in this cultivation city. A cultivation city was a city where cultivators lived. Among them, only cultivators could stay in this city. Other living beings Even ordinary people who used to be cultivators were not qualified to enter this city at all. There were many such cities in the entire second level. It could be said that there were countless of them. The level of cultivators that each city could support was also different. Among them, the cultivation city where Taoist Yuanzhong resided was the one that could accommodate the highest level of cultivators. In other words, the strongest powerhouse on this continent, the false saint realm, could stay here and not cause any irreparable damage because of their existence. It was precisely because of this that Taoist Yuanzhong could choose to stay in this cultivation city. As for the inspiration that Taoist Yuanzhong had when he was talking to Fairy Exine, it was actually not that complicated. It was nothing more than spreading the things that happened to cultivators to the world, or rather, to the continent. It must be known that because the native cultivators on this continent lacked knowledge and could not determine how to construct the most compatible world with their own cultivation path, they would encounter bottlenecks at certain levels that they could not break through. Then, what about the continent? Would this continent encounter a bottleneck in its development due to the same reason? This seemed absurd, but if one thought about it carefully, the possibility of it happening was not small. It must be known that every continent on this continent was actually a world, and could even be called a heaven and earth. As long as it was a world, as long as it was a heaven and earth, it would naturally pursue continuous advancement and sublimation. Not to mention other things, the perfect heaven and earth would continue to advance and sublimate through the great tribulation of heaven and earth, and eventually become a grand heaven and earth. The grand heaven and earth were not unchanging. Although it was impossible for existences who had not become true saints to figure out how they advanced and how they advanced, there must be a method of advancement and sublimation that belonged to that level, or rather a system. Otherwise, there would not be so many true saints stationed in a certain grand heaven and earth. Even the perfect heaven and earth and the grand heaven and earth were like this, not to mention this continent. Since there was a need for advancement and sublimation, it was natural that it would encounter some kind of bottleneck. At a certain time, when it reached a certain level, the advancement and sublimation of this world would directly stop. It might even eventually decline. This was obviously the bottleneck of the advancement and sublimation of the world. If one were to make an analogy based on the situation of cultivators, one would be able to roughly deduce the various characteristics of this world. And the solution was obviously very simple. That Xine fairy's request was already the biggest hint to him. As long as he handed over enough world structures to this continent and increased its knowledge, he would naturally be able to shake off the bottleneck of the continent's advancement and sublimation, and this continent would finally have a brighter future. This was obviously not a difficult task for Taoist Yuanzhong, who thought that he had seen billions of worlds. The only difficulty was perhaps to make this world accept the world structure methods that he handed over. Obviously, this was the only difficulty that was currently holding Taoist Yuanzhong back. This world was not something that could be accepted by you and a child. If he wanted this world to accept the world structure that he sent up, he had to at least make this world acknowledge his world structure. This was like asking a high and mighty leader. How could he possibly come to you and listen to you just because you talked nonsense? Moreover, Taoist Yuanzhong could not find a way to directly contact the world or the continent itself with 999 floors of the high tower, nor did he know where to exert his strength. Over the years, although Taoist Yuanzhong had tried countless methods, he could only watch helplessly as the structures of the worlds he sent out gradually dissipated. It's still too simple. I can't even find a way to directly contact the continent's instincts. Taoist Yuanzhong could not help but sigh inwardly. He had also attempted to condense the light of heaven and earth before, although he could not even condense the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. He still used this process to gain an extraordinary understanding of both the will of heaven and earth and the power of the light of heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, his understanding of the world's instincts was naturally not comparable to that of ordinary native cultivators. It could be said that during his many years of attempts, there were several methods that could almost certainly be used to contact the continent's instincts. However, in the end, everything turned into bubbles. Until now, he had not been able to contact the continent's instincts with 999 floors of the high tower, let alone make the continent accept his world structure, let alone make the continent on the second floor owe him a lot of karma. Faced with such a situation, Taoist Yuanzheng naturally seemed to be quite depressed. With a slight thought, he left his cave residence, intending to relax. A cultivation city naturally had a large number of cultivators here. Among these cultivators, there was no lack of false saints. Among them, some were native cultivators, and some were outsiders. Needless to say, the native cultivators were on the second floor of the continent. Staying in the city on this floor was much safer than staying in other places. Under such circumstances, some native cultivators who were worried about the safety outside naturally sharpened their heads and went into the city. After such a long period of time, the number of cultivators in Xiali City naturally increased by a lot. In addition to the native cultivators, there were also many outsiders. However, they generally would not stay in the city for long. Most of them would come to the city to do things, either to inquire about information or to ask for help to do all kinds of troublesome or difficult things for them. However, due to the frequent entry and exit of foreign cultivators, there would be a relatively large number of foreign cultivators coming in. This caused the number of foreign cultivators in the city to be quite large. At least, there were not many fluctuations. As for this place, it was only the second floor of the 999 floors of the high tower. It was considered the first of the first floors, so why were there so many foreign cultivators staying here? The reason was even simpler. One must know that the layout of the 999 floors of the high tower was different from the very beginning. As time passed, as the number of native cultivators in each floor increased, and as they continued to transform the continent, the characteristics of each floor continued to strengthen. After hundreds of millions of years of accelerated time, even the second level of the continent had many characteristics that the continents on the other levels did not have. These characteristics were obviously quite useful to foreign cultivators. At the very least, they were quite useful to some specific foreign cultivators. Therefore, even though this was only the beginning of the 999 floors of the high tower, there were still many foreign cultivators staying here. In contrast, although the first floor also had its own characteristics, it was not very useful to foreign cultivators, so there were not many foreign cultivators staying here. It was not only the situation of these two floors that was so different. In fact, in the 999 floors of the high tower, the situation of each floor was random. Perhaps the characteristics of this floor were very useful to foreign cultivators, so there were many foreign cultivators staying here. As for the next level, even though it had some special characteristics, it was useless to foreign cultivators. As such, apart from the foreign cultivators who had to pass through this continent in order to reach the next level, no other foreign cultivators stayed there. The specific situation was completely dependent on luck, or in other words, it depended on the needs of the foreign cultivators. Chapter 25-23. Taoist Yuanzheng had been mingling in this city for many years. Even though he spent most of his time cultivating, he was still quite familiar with this city. Unknowingly, he had also become familiar with many foreign cultivators. It was not difficult for him to find people he could communicate with. Fellow Taoist, didn't you say you were cultivating in seclusion? Why did you come out after just a few years? Could it be that you've already obtained something? A fellow Taoist asked Taoist Yuanzheng with a smile. Upon hearing this, Taoist Yuanzheng smiled bitterly and said, "It's not that simple. I just couldn't figure out what to do, so I came out for a stroll." Fellow Taoist, could it be that you haven't collected enough of that thing? One drop of that thing can only be obtained in 100 years. I need 500 kilograms of it. How can it be so easy to collect all of it? The cultivator chuckled. The thing they were talking about was the reason why most of the foreign cultivators stayed on the second layer of the continent. That thing was actually not some kind of liquid that actually existed. Instead, it was a kind of essence, a kind of magical existence that contained the essence extracted from the laws of this continent. This kind of wonderful existence was limited in the second layer. At least, it was limited in a certain period of time. Generally speaking, each city could only gather dozens of drops every 100 years. This kind of essence had many wonderful uses for the deeper layers of the continent. It could help foreign cultivators obtain certain things in the deeper layers. This was the reason why there were foreign cultivators who stayed here to collect it. Although each city could gather dozens of drops every 100 years, the amount that could be gathered on the entire continent was obviously quite large. Unfortunately, this kind of essence wasn't something that only a single foreign cultivator needed. In fact, it was not only foreign cultivators who needed it. Unless one had the strength to completely suppress all the other cultivators on this continent, all foreign cultivators could only abide by the rules and take turns to collect this essence with other cultivators. As for this fellow Taoist who was talking to Taoist Yuan Zheng, he could only get one drop every 100 years. Thankfully, the flow of time on this level was billions of times faster than the flow of time on the other levels. Otherwise, even if foreign cultivators were patient enough, there was no way they would waste their time to come here and wait for a single drop of time every 100 years. In that case, this layer of the continent would definitely descend into absolute chaos. The war might completely change the peaceful environment of this layer. In fact, such things were happening on a deeper level in the continents where the flow of time had yet to change. Hearing this, Taoist Yuan Zheng said, "Actually, with your knowledge, it's enough to exchange for that item from the native cultivators." The reason why the foreign cultivators needed the essence was because they wanted to find something else in one of the deeper levels. As for the native cultivators on this level, they obtained this essence for the sake of cultivating and to refine the various principles and profundities within it that would be helpful to them. However, this wasn't something that couldn't be replaced. As long as there was enough to achieve the same effect, they would definitely not be stingy with these essences. Based on Taoist Yuan Zheng's experience, it was very obvious that as long as he brought out some knowledge of foreign cultivators, those native cultivators would definitely come crying to exchange for it. Upon hearing this, the fellow cultivator shook his head and said, "You're wrong, fellow Taoist. Knowledge is priceless. It's not like I don't have time to wait. So why should I use priceless knowledge to exchange for these essences that can be obtained as long as I wait?" Hearing this, Taoist Yuan Zheng could only shake his head. He naturally disapproved of this kind of thinking, but there was no need for him to argue with the other party. It was the most difficult thing to change the thinking of intelligent beings. How could he do such a strenuous and unrewarding thing when it was not necessary? Moreover, although the cultivator in front of him had this kind of thinking, it didn't mean that others had to follow it. He didn't reject Taoist Yuan Zheng's attitude of disregarding his own knowledge and spreading it everywhere. Under such circumstances, Taoist Yuan Zheng naturally knew what he should do. The two of them didn't continue on this topic. Instead, they chatted about everything under the sun and gave pointers about the world. They spent quite a few days happily. On this day, Taoist Yuan Zheng suddenly saw streams of light flashing in the sky. They cut through the void and left long traces in the void, which only disappeared after a while. Following this change, the mainland seemed to have undergone some subtle changes, as if something had appeared. Taoist Yuan Zheng was slightly surprised. He could sense that there seemed to be some kind of indescribable mystery in this stream of light, as if some kind of living being was carrying out some kind of indescribable transformation on this mainland. It's here again. Which indigenous cultivator has become a false saint? His fellow cultivators sighed at this moment. After all, the indigenous cultivators and the outsiders were still two different camps. Even though the conflict between the two camps had eased up, two camps were still two different camps. This kind of different camp would cause the strength of any side to increase, and it would bring about a great impact on the other side. This was the case for the outsiders, and it was the same for the indigenous cultivators. For the outsiders, the increase in powerhouses among the indigenous cultivators meant that the opposing camp had become more powerful, which made it more difficult for them to do anything to the indigenous cultivators in the future. For the indigenous cultivators, The increase in powerhouses from the outsiders was equally dangerous. After all, the outsiders were truly stronger than the indigenous cultivators. Now that their strength was equal, the outsiders could only behave according to the indigenous cultivators' rules. If the strength of the outsiders far surpassed that of the indigenous cultivators one day, would they still be interested in following the indigenous cultivators' rules? With such a mentality, one could imagine what the fellow cultivator who was an outsider would think when he saw the phenomenon of an indigenous cultivator becoming a false saint. Taoist Yuan Zheng didn't care about this at all. The conflict between the foreign cultivators and the indigenous cultivators didn't affect him at all. After all, he was an outsider in essence, but everything he was doing now seemed to be that of an indigenous cultivator. In this way, he would benefit no matter which side won. So he naturally didn't need to care about the conflict between the two camps at all. However, although he didn't care about the increase in strength of the indigenous cultivators, he was still in a daze at this moment. There was no other reason, but because he discovered something that he had previously overlooked during this process. It's impossible to connect with the instincts of this mainland of the tall tower just by doing it out of thin air. However, if there's a carrier, it seems to be a rather simple matter. This thought suppressed the various problems that he had encountered over the past few days and caused him to suddenly have countless bursts of inspiration. The source of this inspiration was obviously the changes that the false saints had caused to this mainland when they achieved their false saints. In fact, he had long known that the false saints would change this mainland after they achieved their false saints. After all, the false saints entrusted everything about themselves to the surrounding space-time, or rather, they entrusted everything about themselves to the world they were in. The world they were in. This kind of entrustment allowed them to be indestructible as long as the world was not destroyed. However, at the same time, everything about the false saints would naturally have some feedback effects on the world outside. Obviously, this effect would definitely return to change the world. Previously, Taoist Yuan Zheng didn't pay too much attention to this process, and he only took a look at it. Even when he was a false saint who had entrusted himself to the surrounding space-time, he didn't think much about this at all. He just thought that this was normal. However, at this moment, when his thoughts drilled into a dead end and he looked at this again, he suddenly discovered something that he had overlooked. The place where he was now was not a normal space-time or a normal world. This was the mainland of the tall tower that was created by the ruler of the Forbidden Land, the 999-story mainland. With the wonderful nature of the mainland of the tall tower, this kind of change definitely wouldn't appear out of thin air. Instead, it would definitely be related to the instincts of the mainland of the tall tower. After understanding this, how could he not know how to connect with the instincts of the mainland of the tall tower with 999 stories? With a slight jolt in his heart, he could no longer suppress the urge to cultivate in his heart. He directly told the fellow Taoist in front of him that he had comprehended something and wanted to go back into closed-door cultivation again. He was about to leave. As for Taoist Yuan Zheng leaving to go back into closed-door cultivation, the fellow Taoist naturally couldn't stop him. He just congratulated Taoist Yuan Zheng and sent her away. Although he's a foreign cultivator, why does he act so much like a native cultivator? After Taoist Yuan Zheng left, the fellow Taoist thought to himself with a frown. For foreign cultivators, what was the point of cultivating in the mainland of the tall tower with 999 stories? The level of their strength had already far surpassed that of the mainland. The reason why they acted so weak was only because of the suppression of the mainland of the tall tower with 999 stories. Under such circumstances, what they were pursuing in the Spire continent should be the final land of opportunity, and not to cultivate in it. After all, no matter how much they cultivated, they would just repeat the path that they had walked before. Moreover, because of the suppression of the mainland, no matter how much they improved, it was impossible for them to break through the suppression and advance further. Under such circumstances, cultivating was obviously even more useless. Only the native cultivators would be different from them. Obviously, Taoist Yuan Zheng's performance had always been similar to that of the native cultivators, but not the same as that of the foreign cultivators. It could be said that if he hadn't clearly recognized Taoist Yuan Zheng's nature and knew that some of his characteristics were not possessed by the native cultivators, he might have suspected that Taoist Yuan Zheng was a native cultivator who deliberately pretended to be a foreign cultivator to get information from him. After thinking about it, the fellow Taoist shook his head and no longer paid attention to Taoist Yuan Zheng's abnormality. The cultivation path was endless. Who knew what other people's cultivation path was special and mysterious? Perhaps Taoist Yuan Zheng was just an outsider with a slightly special cultivation path. Naturally, Taoist Yuan Zheng didn't know that his performance had surprised the fellow Taoist. But even if he knew, he obviously wouldn't care. After all, to him, improving himself through cultivation was the only thing he could rely on to obtain freedom. Apart from that, everything else didn't matter to him. He returned to his cave abode. With a thought, an indescribable aura instantly seeped out of his body. He was also a false saint. Although he had already transcended the shackles of the outside world space-time, he was still a false saint after all. Since he was a false saint, he naturally also possessed the abilities that a false saint possessed. Even if it was a method that could trigger the instincts of the Tall Tower continent, it was still an extremely simple thing for him to do. At this moment, with a thought, he directly triggered the aura that had already been eliminated and integrated with the outside world space-time, and it gradually spread out in all directions. This aura came from a false saint who was closely integrated with the surrounding space-time. However, it didn't necessarily need to be closely integrated with the outside world space-time to be able to emit it. For existences of a higher realm, it couldn't be any easier to separate aura from reality. Under such circumstances, it was easy for Taoist Yuan Zheng to just emit his aura without integrating with the outside world space-time. As the aura changed, the surrounding space-time seemed to undergo some subtle changes. It was as if there was an extremely obscure and inconceivable existence that seemed to be a supreme being staring at him. I succeeded. At this moment, Taoist Yuan Zheng understood that he had succeeded. The instincts of the Tall Tower continent had indeed been triggered by him. The strange feeling he had now was none other than the instincts of the Tall Tower continent that were using its senses to sense him. Or rather, it was using its sight to lock onto him. Taking advantage of this opportunity, he sent out thousands of world structure maps without hesitation. He sent them to the unknown origin, but it was obviously the instincts of the Tall Tower continent. For the instincts, there was obviously no place in the Tall Tower continent that could surpass its senses. At this time, when these world structure diagrams appeared, it instinctively flashed and automatically accepted these world structure diagrams. When all the world structure maps gradually disappeared as if they had vanished into thin air, Taoist Yuan Zheng knew that he had successfully completed this step and was qualified to proceed to the next step. Chapter 25-24. Following the explosion of Taoist Yuan Zheng's power, the void in front of him began to distort violently. Countless mysterious existences emerged out of thin air and began to rapidly gather in front of his palm. They split and regrouped, eventually forming a space-time, then a complete world. Finally, they completely merged with the void and became a part of it. At this moment, Taoist Yuan Zheng could not help but feel an indescribable apprehension in his heart. Even though he had already calculated it clearly and felt that there would be no problem with this, it was still just a calculation after all. What was the truth? And whether he had overlooked any factors, he was still a little worried before he actually tried it. At this moment, he switched his vision to the perspective of karma. The scene of reality in front of him immediately receded and turned into endless karma in the blink of an eye. At this moment, he suddenly felt that endless karma began to spread out from his body, directly connecting to this continent and to the similar 998 levels behind this continent. A light and incomparably comfortable feeling emerged from the bottom of his heart at this moment. The source of this feeling was none other than the vast and boundless continent outside of his body. Taoist Yuan Zheng completely relaxed in an instant. I've succeeded. Sure enough, by doing this, this continent of the spire owes me a lot of karma. As he thought of this, an inexplicable joy appeared on his face. The various feelings he had just now were clearly the manifestation of the large amount of karma owed to him by the surrounding heaven and earth. And the source of this karma was obviously the world in front of him at this very moment. In fact, it was precisely this karma that prevented Taoist Yuan Zheng from suffering from the backlash of the continent of the spire. After all, what he was doing now was carving the world into the system of the continent of the spire. If the continent of the spire did not approve of this action, it would be equivalent to stuffing a piece of tofu into a rock. In the end, the tofu would be crushed, and the finger of the person who stuffed the tofu would be injured. Only the continent of the spire approved of his action, which was equivalent to automatically emptying out a space that was big enough to accommodate the tofu. Only then could the tofu be stuffed into the rock unscathed. And only then could the finger of the person who stuffed the tofu not be injured. Now that the continent of the spire had established such a karma connection with Taoist Yuan Zheng, it clearly meant that the continent of the spire had completely approved of Taoist Yuan Zheng's action. He approved of the act of fusing the world he had created into the spire continent. At this moment, the world that appeared in front of Taoist Yuan Zheng was mysterious and wonderful. It contained the complete mystery of the world, and this was only secondary. More importantly, this world was vastly different from the common sense of the 999-story spire continent. Heaven and earth did not have a clear distinction between up and down. Instead, it was in an extremely strange state of interweaving and merging. Everything in it was completely compatible with this strange state where the top and bottom interweaved and fused. Although it seemed extremely absurd to outsiders, it was extremely natural and normal in that world. There wasn't a single trace of awkwardness to be seen. Obviously, such a world was some sort of expansion for the continent, with 999 floors of the tower. And it was precisely this expansion that allowed Taoist Yuan Zheng to achieve his goal of making the world owe him karma. If it works, then I won't have to worry about karma anymore. Taoist Yuan Zheng murmured. Without any hesitation, he directly sent the structural maps of the world through his own aura to the instinct of the continent of the 999 floors of the tower, allowing the instinct to accept them without any resistance. Taoist Yuan Zheng had as many structural maps of the world as he wanted, which were different from the concept of the continent of the tower. Not to mention the ones he had created, even the various worlds and heavens he had seen in other places in the great heaven and earth could not be described with numbers. To him, selecting thousands of them from such a terrifying number was as easy as lifting his hand. However, it was obvious that it was quite easy for him to create different worlds. Nevertheless, Taoist Yuan Zheng had no interest in doing so. It was not just because it was unnecessary. It was also because he was worried that things would turn in the opposite direction when pushed to the extreme. Not to mention anything else, in the previous level, wasn't he rejected by the continent because he owed it too much karma? At that time, he had merely turned the land of loathsome spirits into a normal area. But there was already such a strong rejection. Now he had created many worlds and integrated them into the second level of the continent. Compared to changing the land of loathsome spirits, this was a much greater effort. Under such circumstances, if he really did not restrain himself and created thousands of worlds, the karma that the continent of the tower owed him would increase to an unimaginable level. When that time came, let alone the rejection, there might even be a direct destruction. With such a concern, it was impossible for him to waste time creating too many worlds and integrating them into the continent of the tower. Moreover, apart from these, there was also a faint worry in his heart. Clearly, the ruler of the Forbidden Land did not send him here just for fun. Perhaps his existence was to experiment with some mechanism or situation. Or perhaps he was paving a path for those who came after him. If the latter was the case, if he integrated too many worlds into the continent of the tower, wouldn't he be cutting off the path for those who came after him? If that happened, if the ruler of the Forbidden Land was displeased, he would have to bear the consequences. It was because of these various reasons that Taoist Yuan Zheng gave up on the idea of squeezing as many worlds as he could into the continent of the tower. In the end, after creating dozens of worlds, Taoist Yuan Zheng stopped. As the dozens of worlds were created, an indescribable feeling appeared in his heart. In a trance, he seemed to have seen the essence of the continent of the tower at a glance. He seemed to have seen the endless mysteries that could only be comprehended by those who had entered the tribulation. Along with these feelings, the immeasurable karma that was originally tightly connected to him seemed to have been ignited. It began to merge into the flame bit by bit and eventually disappeared. Evidently, although he didn't take the initiative to ask the mainland of the High Pagoda to repay his karma, the mainland of the High Pagoda owed him so much karma that no living being could bear it. Hence, the mainland of the High Pagoda had no choice but to take the initiative to instill benefits into Taoist Yuan Zheng's heart, using this method to repay him and reduce the karma as much as possible. This should be enough for me to advance to the first level of the Tao Master Path. Taoist Yuan Zheng could feel the endless karma that was connected to him from the continent of the tower, and he could not help but show a relaxed expression on his face. For Taoist Yuan Zheng, the realms before the Tao Master Path were not difficult at all for him. As long as he was willing, he could even seal himself in the world that he created and use his own memory to cross the realms little by little. However, the situation was obviously different if he wanted to step into the realm of experts who entered the tribulation. As a creature born and raised in the Tao Master Great World, he did not step on the reverse path like Luo Fan did. Instead, he continued to move forward according to the normal path. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. He could not trigger the great tribulation that could make him transform. This, of course, was much safer. He did not have to struggle on the line between life and death every time he faced a great tribulation. But at the same time, he could not be like Luo Fan, who only needed to pass through the great tribulation to transform himself and step into a higher level. It could be said that if the Tao Master Path did not exist, most cultivators, including Taoist Yuan Zheng, would only be able to stay below the realm of experts who enter the tribulation. In other words, the peak of the Supreme Emperor realm. Most of them were cultivators, including almost all the cultivators on the path to becoming a Tao Master. Only a very small number of cultivators who were lucky or had the support of a true saint had the opportunity to cross this almost impossible bottleneck and step into the realm of experts who entered the tribulation. At present, Taoist Yuan Zheng's original realm of a 5 tribulation expert had been completely sealed. Even with his strength, he could not sense the existence of his previous realm and strength. In this state, he was not much different from a cultivator who had cultivated normally. In this way, if he wanted to break through this bottleneck, it would be impossible for him to rely on himself and his past memories. Only by following the same method as the native cultivators of this world, absorbing endless nutrients from the surrounding continent of the tower and gaining endless principles and mysteries, could he finally break through this bottleneck and step into the realm of experts who enter the tribulation, or even go one step further and return to his original realm of a 5 tribulation expert. Obviously, this was equivalent to establishing a karmic connection with the continent of the tower. If he had not made the continent of the spire owe him a huge amount of karma in advance, and if he hadn't scrupulously sought the truths and mysteries that he needed from the continent of the spire, the karma that would have been caused by such an action would have been enough to completely cut off his path of cultivation. This was the real limit. This was also the reason why Taoist Yuan Zheng was so eager to make the continent of the tower owe him karmic connection. As for why, without the help of the Tao Master Path, it was impossible for ordinary cultivators who took the right path to become experts in the tribulation, but why there were so many experts in the deepest part of the land of opportunity, and why Luo Fan had also encountered enemies who were above the realm of experts in the tribulation, it was not a mistake. Both of them had their own special characteristics. The fact that Luo Fan had built the continent of the tower outside the last land of opportunity was enough to give it such incredible power. and even gave him the confidence to replace the first few levels of the Tao Master Path. The final part of the Land of Opportunity was closer to the final opportunity, and was greatly influenced by the endless information and mysteries revealed by the final opportunity. It was not surprising that experts in the tribulation and entering tribulation could be born there. Even so, because of the imperfection of that part of the world, the experts in the tribulation and entering tribulation could not transcend heaven and earth. Even if they were experts in the tribulation and entering tribulation, once they left that incomplete part of the world, they could not resist the surrounding chaotic starry sky and would be completely devoured by the chaotic starry sky. Needless to say, there were many experts who were above the level of experts in the tribulation and entering tribulation. The tribulation came from the state of chaos. Even if its essence was not as good as the Tao Master Path, it was not much worse. It was the same for any tribulation. Under the circumstances where there was not much of a difference in levels, if the path of Tao Master could create something, it was not surprising that the Great Tribulation could create it as well. If one wanted to step into the level of experts in the tribulation and entering tribulation, one would need the help of the environment. This was common sense for the cultivators on the Tao Master Path. Taoist Yuan Zheng was very clear about this. Therefore, he did not think about the above at this time. When he realized that he had caused the mainland of the High Tower to owe him enough karma, he directly sealed off his senses, cut off all connections between himself and the mainland of the High Tower, and fell into a state of self-cultivation. For him, the endless principles and mysteries that were poured into his body were of some use, but they were completely unnecessary. Before he encountered the biggest bottleneck of the experts in the tribulation and entering tribulation, these principles and mysteries were dispensable. No matter how one looked at it, it was an absolute waste to waste the karma that he had painstakingly caused the mainland of the High Tower to owe him. As Taoist Yuan Zheng cut off all connections, he was completely immersed in his own memories. Time passed by minute. Before he knew it, 10 billion years had passed. These 10 billion years were naturally the time in the second layer of the mainland. Compared to the outside world, these 10 billion years were only equivalent to a few months. During these 10 billion years, the cultivation level in the second layer began to improve continuously, and the strength of the foreign cultivators in the second layer was constantly unlocked. Unknowingly, after 10 billion years, the strength of the foreign cultivators had been raised to the highest level below the experts in the tribulation. In other words, they had reached the bottleneck that required the help of the environment to have a chance to break through. This change shocked the cultivators who had some understanding of the mainland of the High Tower. After all, the environment of the second layer of the mainland was much worse than that of the continents in the deeper layers. Chapter 25:25. All these actions obviously represented a fact, and that was Taoist Yuan Zheng had forcibly pushed his cultivation realm to the peak of the Supreme Emperor realm in the past 10 billion years by relying on his memories as a 5 tribulation expert. This speed of improvement was extremely fast compared to the time taken to break through that could be calculated in billions of years. Of course, if one were to compare it to the speed of improvement of the foreign cultivators after the restrictions were lifted, it was obviously a hopelessly slow speed. I can finally see it. At this moment, in Taoist Yuan Zheng's cave mansion, his aura filled the entire cave mansion. Strange and powerful waves constantly seeped out of the cave mansion, changing the surrounding space-time. Even the numerous worlds in front of him, which had a very different concept from the mainland of the High Tower, began to change strangely, as if they were about to be expelled. This also meant that he had released the seal he had placed on himself. His body and mind were once again connected to the mainland of the High Tower. Although he had just reached this realm, he had already completely mastered all the mysteries of this realm because of his past memories. At this moment, all the native cultivators in this realm, for him, were existences that could be dealt with a slap. After all, the perspective of the strong and the weak could not be compared at all. Although his current realm was only the peak of the Supreme Emperor realm, his former self was a five tribulation expert. His knowledge, boldness, and mastery of the principles and mysteries of cultivation were far more profound than that of the supreme emperor realm. Even an ordinary expert in the tribulation realm would not be able to put up much resistance against him, let alone the supreme emperor realm among the native cultivators. However, the current Taoist Yuanzheng did not indulge in such vigilance. At this moment, he was already constantly seeking the deep principles and mysteries contained in the second layer of the space-time around him. He constantly incorporated these deep principles and mysteries into his body and mind, striving to use these principles and mysteries to break through the bottleneck that he now encountered, which was like a natural moat. The biggest bottleneck before an expert in the tribulation realm. Even with his previous experience, this wasn't an easy task for him. In fact, it was several times more difficult than the first time he tried to break through the bottleneck of this natural chasm. After all, he had relied on the principles and mysteries of the Tao Master Path. Now, he could only rely on the deeper principles and mysteries of the Spire Continent. Even if the Spire Continent could replace the Tao Master's Path to a certain extent, the creator of the two was completely different. The creators of the Tao Master Path were the many Tao Masters and true saints in the Tao Master Great Universe. The creator of the High Spire Continent was just Luo Fan, who had just passed the sixth tribulation. The gap between the creators was like the difference between heaven and earth. It was destined that the Spire Continent could never be compared to the path of a Tao Master, even with the help of the countless information and mysteries that seeped out from the last opportunity. Just the first level of the Tao Sovereign Path was enough for a cultivator to step into the tribulation stage. However, the Spire Continent required 100 or 200 continents to reach that level. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine the density of the principles and mysteries of the second level that could help him break through the bottleneck of the heavenly chasm. Even though Taoist Yuanzheng was an experienced expert who could use the endless principles and mysteries of this continent to advance his realm, he still felt powerless. Although he was making progress, the speed was as slow as a snail. Taoist Yuanzheng sighed inwardly and walked out of his cave abode. After 10 billion years, the general outline of the city had not changed, but the changes in the details were quite significant. For the native cultivators of this continent, 10 billion years was obviously not a short period of time. During such a long period of time, the cultivators in the city would naturally change several times. As the cultivators changed, the situation in the city would naturally change accordingly. Hey, fellow Taoist, you're still here? Taoist Yuanzheng sensed a familiar aura and could not help but feel surprised. He transmitted his voice to him. That aura did not come from anyone else, but from a fellow Taoist who was searching for the specialty essence of the second level of the continent with whom he had conversed once before. Although 10 billion years had passed, this fellow Taoist did not seem to have changed at all except that his cultivation realm had increased to the same level as Taoist Yuanzheng. He was still as carefree as before. The passage of time did not seem to leave any trace on his body. I'm the one who's going to ask that question. The fellow Taoist chuckled. Taoist Yuanzheng's heart jolted. In a flash, he had already arrived in front of the fellow Taoist's cave abode. At this moment, the cultivator was sitting in front of his cave abode as if he was enjoying the scenery. Fellow Taoist, if you're looking for that thing, you should have collected it long ago. I remember that you only needed 500 kilograms back then, right? Taoist Yuanzheng asked. If a cultivator could obtain 1 drop of the essence in 100 years, it would be 100 million drops in 10 billion years. With such an amount, not to mention 500 kilograms, it would be more than enough to collect 10,000 kilograms or even 100,000 kilograms. In that case, even if the cultivator obediently followed the rules to collect the essence, he should have collected enough essence to leave the second level of the continent billions of years ago. The cultivator smiled and said, "What's so strange about that? It's just that I suddenly felt that it's more profitable to collect the essence here. So, I stayed here to collect the essence." Oh, could it be that you've exchanged the essence for what you originally wanted to collect? Taoist Yuanzheng came to a sudden realization. The essence in the second level was an excellent supplementary material for native cultivators to cultivate. The native cultivator collected these materials to help him cultivate so that he could use the essence to increase his cultivation realm by one or several levels. However, it was meaningless for outsiders to cultivate in the continent of the tall tower. For them, as long as the native cultivators could improve their cultivation realm, they would naturally relax their suppression, and in the end, the strength they could unleash would increase. Therefore, for them, collecting the essence was obviously not for their own cultivation. They were here because there was something useful to outsiders in the deeper levels of the continent of the tall tower, and they needed the essence to obtain it. When the cultivator first came here, it was obvious that he came to the second level to obtain the essence. But now, he had suddenly stayed here obediently and had no intention of going deeper to obtain that item. There was only one possibility. That was, he had already obtained the item. As for how he obtained it, it was needless to say. There was actually such a thing as a transaction in this world. The essence was a prerequisite to obtaining the item. As such, the cultivator who possessed this essence naturally had the right to trade with other cultivators. He only needed to provide the essence in exchange for other cultivators to act for him, and he would naturally obtain the item. The cultivator chuckled and said, "That's right. After all, collecting the essence takes a long time, and for those fellow Taoists, this period of time is quite precious. They're more than happy to have me waste their time for them." Hearing this, Taoist Yuan Zheng could only sigh in admiration. Although the flow of time was different to the outside world, 10 billion years in this level was only equivalent to a few years or even a few months, and it did not seem like much time was wasted. However, one should not forget that this was only to the outside world. To the beings on the second level, it was a solid 10 billion years. Staying in such a place where they could not cultivate, and where there were no principles or mysteries that they were interested in, for most outsiders, it was obviously a great torment. Because of this, if they could save this time by paying a price that could be easily compensated, it was obviously a great deal for most outsiders. Of course, this did not mean that the cultivator in front of Taoist Yuan Zheng would suffer a lot of torture and suffering. After all, there were differences between cultivators. To other cultivators, staying on the second level was a torture and a waste of time, but perhaps to him, he needed so much time to do something. Therefore, his choice was not without cost. Fellow Taoist, I didn't see you when I was collecting the essence. If that's the case, why did you stay on this level for so long? The cultivator asked with a smile. Taoist Yuan Zheng smiled and said, "I'm just doing some special cultivation. Don't you already know about this, fellow Taoist? I did hear about it back then, and I guessed some of it. However, I didn't expect you to spend so many years here, which is quite different from what I guessed." The cultivator sighed. Taoist Yuan Zheng did not explain much, and just avoided this topic. Then, he casually asked about the various situations on the Spire continent over the years. As the conversation went on, Taoist Yuan Zheng gradually learned about the various special developments during the 10 billion years he cultivated in seclusion. He did not know if it was because of his actions back then, but the Spire continent seemed to have undergone various subtle changes over the years, and it seemed to have become more complicated. According to this cultivator, there were many strange, secret realms on the second level over the years. These secret realms seemed to be extremely fragile, but they were different from all the secret realms that had appeared on this continent in the past. They seemed to have more variety, and the changes were more complicated. Moreover, it was said that the so-called Tao ancestor seemed to be extremely irritated in a deeper level. It seemed that some kind of change had increased the difficulty of accelerating the flow of time on the continent. Moreover, it was said that a certain foreign cultivator seemed to be looking for something and then triggered some mechanism on the Spire continent. It seemed that he was locked in a certain level. Taoist Yuan Zheng's unfamiliarity with the High Pagoda continent was gradually dispelled by all these hearsay and well-founded rumors. He vaguely realized that many things could be traced back to the things he had done before. In other words, many of these things seemed to have been caused by his actions. Those secret realms should be here, As he thought about this, he suddenly became interested in the secret realms that were born on the second level. After asking about the location of those secret realms, he bade farewell to this cultivator. These newly born secret realms were new things on this continent, and they represented all kinds of new interests. It was obvious that most of these new benefits were occupied by the various sects on the second level. In other words, these mystic realms were not accessible to ordinary cultivators. Of course, this was only for other cultivators. For Taoist Yuanzheng, the situation was obviously different. It should be known that Taoist Yuanzheng was currently at the peak of the Supreme Emperor stage. Compared to the native cultivators on the second level, who were only at the Fall Saint stage, such a realm was already tens of thousands of times stronger. With such a difference in strength, unless his request had already touched the fundamental interests of the sects, and as long as the sects did not want to be destroyed, they would never agree to it. Otherwise, the sects would not refuse most of his requests. For example, entering those secret realms to have a look, to appreciate the scenery within. This was obviously not the fundamental requirement of the existence of their sections. Fresh interests meant that these interests had yet to merge with the foundations of the sections. Naturally, if they were lost, it would not be a big deal. Just like that, Taoist Yuanzheng soon entered the largest and most complete secret realm with ease. This secret realm was located above the clouds. It was extremely high up in the sky. This place used to be empty, without any signs of life. There was nothing apart from the void. However, with the appearance of this secret realm, it became extremely lively. A large number of cultivators appeared here and built cultivation cities one after another. Obviously, the various sects had their own stations here, and a large number of cultivators were stationed here to manage these cities and restrict the cultivators who entered and left this secret realm. Chapter 25-26. This secret realm was extremely marvelous. Every direction was the same: up, down, left, right, front, and back. To outsiders, it was unimaginably strange, almost subverting their worldview. However, to the creatures that were born and bred in this secret realm, this structure was extremely normal and natural. Compared to them, the outsiders, who had a clear sense of direction, seemed even stranger. The structure of this world was quite different from the structure of the continent of the high tower that Taoist Yuanzheng had given. However, on the whole, they were almost the same in essence. He could naturally tell at a glance that it was formed by the combination of the world structure that he had given to the continent of the high tower. It seems that this continent of the high tower will become richer and more complete. One day, it might really be comparable to the Tao Master's path. Taoist Yuanzheng had such a ridiculous thought, but soon he shook his head and tossed the thought to the back of his mind. Even if there was a slight tendency to replace the Tao Master's path, it was only a slight tendency. If this development trend continued, it would probably take billions of years for him to help the continent of the high tower. Only then would there be a slight possibility of achieving this. With such an astonishing difficulty, how could it be a problem that he should be thinking about? Taoist Yuanzheng did not leave the secret realm right away. Instead, he stayed in the secret realm for 100 years, exploring all the mysteries of the secret realm. After he identified the differences between the structure of the world in the continent of the tower and the one in his instincts, he finally left in a leisurely manner. In the next few thousand years, he walked through all the new secret realms that had appeared in the second layer over the past 10 billion years. Just as he thought, these secret realms were derived from the world structure that he had sent to the continent of the high tower. They were the products formed by the combination of the world structure and the characteristics of the continent of the high tower. In these few thousand years, he had seen all the mysteries within and distinguished the products of the continent of the high tower from the products of the world structure. His understanding of the continent of the high tower had unknowingly deepened. After doing all this, he did not return to his cave residence. Instead, he began to wander all over the second layer of the continent. Through this wandering, he continuously absorbed the principles and mysteries contained in the second layer, which were of great help to him in breaking through the bottleneck of the heavenly moat. Just like that, hundreds of millions of years passed without anyone noticing. During these hundreds of millions of years, Taoist Yuanzhang had traveled across the entire continent. He had unknowingly reached the end of his absorption of the profound truths and mysteries. On this day, he finally had no choice but to stop. That was because he discovered that he had comprehended all the profound principles and profundities of the second level. For him, the effect of these realizations was that the natural barrier that prevented him from becoming a tribulation initiation expert had unknowingly loosened a lot. Although there was still a long way to go before he could truly break through and become a tribulation realm expert, he was already on the path. Is this the limit of this floor? Taoist Yuanzhang sighed and was about to step into the third floor. Suddenly, he felt a strange and familiar feeling coming from the entrance of the second floor, and he sensed it. With a thought, he focused his perception and found that the previous generation's fifth senior brother had passed through the passage and appeared on the second floor of the tower. Compared to the last time they met, the previous generation's fifth senior brother had obviously reached the peak of the false saint realm. Although he was not yet a false saint, he had broken through the biggest shackle he had encountered and was now on the same starting line as Taoist Yuanzhang. Congratulations, fellow Taoist. Taoist Yuanzhang smiled and transmitted his voice into the ears of the fifth senior brother of the previous generation. The previous generation's fifth senior brother heard the voice as soon as he stepped into the second floor. He was in a trance for a moment before he understood what was going on. He could not help but smile bitterly and said, "Compared to fellow Taoist, my achievements are nothing." Taoist Yuanzhang just smiled and said, "I guess fellow Taoist already has a plan for the next step, so I won't interfere. Take care, fellow Taoist. Let's meet again if fate allows it." As he spoke, he did not wait for the previous generation's fifth senior brother to react. With a turn of his body, he entered the passageway leading to the third layer of the continent and began to trigger the test that Luo Fan had set up back then to head to the third layer of the continent. The previous generation's fifth senior brother smiled leisurely when he heard Taoist Yuanzhang's voice transmission. Indeed, after struggling in the first floor for such a long time, he had thought about how to cultivate with the help of the mainland of the tall tower, despite the restrictions of karma. Although he did not fully understand it now, he already had an idea. If Taoist Yuanzhang used his identity as someone who had come here to criticize him, he would definitely be annoyed. Now that Taoist Yuanzhang had left, it was to his liking. However, I wonder what fellow Taoist has been doing on the second floor for so many years. The previous generation's fifth senior brother became curious again. As a cultivator who came through the passage from the upper floor, he was only at the peak of the false saint realm. Obviously, he was not attractive to the many cultivators who guarded the entrance of the passage. After all, to the cultivators who guarded the passage, the ones who were truly attractive were the cultivators from the outside. It was the cultivation methods, the cultivation knowledge, and the cultivation knowledge that they had. However, given the current situation on the second floor of the tall tower, a cultivator from the outside would definitely be at the peak of the Supreme Emperor realm. Obviously, the previous generation's fifth senior brother was currently at the peak of the false saint realm. Therefore, to those cultivators, the previous generation's fifth senior brother was obviously just a local cultivator who was no different from them. Moreover, he was just a local cultivator whose cultivation realm was much lower than theirs. The fact that those cultivators didn't teach such an existence a lesson out of disappointment was already a sign of restraint on their part. How could they have the mood to care about the previous generation's fifth senior brother? Therefore, compared to the encounter between Taoist Yuanzhang and the false Saint Yuzhe, the current previous generation's fifth senior brother was quite relaxed. He did not even notice that there were a large number of cultivators around the exit. It was not difficult for the previous generation's fifth senior brother to find out what Taoist Yuanzhang was doing on the second floor. After all, he was the previous generation's fifth senior brother. Even if his cultivation realm was suppressed to the peak of the false saint realm, and he did not know when he would be able to break through, he was still the previous generation's fifth senior brother. His connections with the foreign cultivators were still there. Under such circumstances, He only needed to use his connections slightly and ask some foreign cultivators to find out what changes had happened on the second floor in the past 10 billion years. Therefore, in just a few days, he had already set his sights on the secret realms that were spread all over the continent, allowing the continent of the High Pagoda to create its own secret realms. Could it be that he helped the continent to expand its understanding of the world? The previous generation's fifth senior brother was extraordinary after all. At this time, he easily thought of this possibility. Compared to Taoist Yuan Zheng, who could easily enter any secret realm, the previous generation's fifth senior brother clearly did not have such convenience. At that time, Taoist Yuan Zheng was already at the peak of the Supreme Emperor stage and was the strongest person on the second floor. Even if he did not have a special identity, the various sects had to give him face and let him enter those secret realms as he pleased. In contrast, the previous generation's fifth senior brother was only an ordinary false saint realm. He was not the strongest even in a certain sect, let alone in the face of the colossus formed by the various sections. How could he be qualified for the various sects to give him face? So, he wanted to enter the secret realm. He had to follow their rules obediently. Moreover, he could not choose whichever secret realm he wanted. It depended on the other party's mood and which secret realm they were willing to open to him. Just like that, after a series of twists and turns, the previous generation's fifth senior brother spent dozens of years to enter a secret realm that was worthless to the various sections. The moment he entered the secret realm, the previous generation's fifth senior brother confirmed his previous guess. Indeed, this was not a world that could be born naturally on the continent of the High Pagoda. With the structure of the continent of the High Pagoda and its isolated state, it could not have seen such a world. Naturally, it could not have given birth to such a world. Only outsiders could have seen such a world and incorporate the structure of such a world into the system of the continent of the High Pagoda. It was obvious that the only person who could do this and had the will to do it was Taoist Yuan Zheng. Seems like he's using this method. This is a backup option. The previous generation's fifth senior brother thought to himself. After working hard for dozens of years to enter the secret realm, he lost interest in it in just a few days. He turned around and left the secret realm, leaving the cultivators guarding the secret realm staring at him with strange expressions. The previous generation's fifth senior brother could think of many ways to make the continent of the High Pagoda owe him karma. Even though Taoist Yuan Zheng's method had been proven to be feasible, he still did not have the intention to take this path directly. He arrived at a very ordinary place on the second level of the continent. It seemed to be just a part of the millions of ordinary areas on the continent. Upon arriving, the previous generation's fifth senior brother looked around at the barren land. With a shake of his body, rays of light rushed out of his body, condensed in the void, and suddenly descended, turning into human figures. After these figures took shape, they immediately bowed to the previous generation's fifth senior brother and addressed him as the Holy Lord. These figures were none other than the elite subordinates of the kingdom that the previous generation's fifth senior brother had built on the first level of the continent of the High Pagoda. Go according to the plan, the previous generation's fifth senior brother said to his subordinates. Upon hearing this, the subordinates bowed and responded, then began to disperse. Among them, some stayed and began to help the previous generation's fifth senior brother build the city, while some directly scattered to different parts of the continent to carry out various plans. Because they had planned this countless times, the previous generation's fifth senior brother subordinates acted in an orderly manner. Every move they made had an obvious purpose, and they did their best to weaken the possible karma connection between them and the second level of the continent. It could be said that they were planning boldly and cautiously compared to them. The previous generation's fifth senior brother seemed to have nothing to do, but in fact, he was extremely nervous. He was constantly paying attention to everything around him, paying attention to his subordinates' every move, and constantly adjusting their behavior in order to stop the karma connection that they might have established with the second level of the continent. Hundreds of years passed just like that. On this day, the previous generation's fifth senior brother, who originally only had a small city built by himself, became the ruler of these hundreds of cities. As he became the ruler, the karma of the second level of the continent that originally didn't seem to be interested in him began to stir, as if it wanted to suppress him, and also as if it wanted to obtain something from him. However, it lost its original calmness. The previous generation's fifth senior brother had long expected this. At this time, he calmly promulgated all kinds of laws that had been considered countless times, and gradually integrated them into the hundreds of cities. As those laws were promulgated, the karma that the second level of the continent represented seemed to have received some kind of impetus. It slowly began to draw something from the previous generation's fifth senior brother, and gradually established a karma connection that the previous generation's fifth senior brother hoped to see. A karma connection that owed a karma. Upon seeing this, the previous generation's fifth senior brother finally let out a long breath. It seems that the first step is a success, he muttered with an inexplicable excitement in his eyes. The laws that he promulgated were of great benefit to the hundreds of cities, and were even of some help to the continent of the tall tower. If such laws were to be followed, the hundreds of cities would certainly become stronger and stronger, and the continent of the tall tower would also benefit from it. The continent of the spire could also benefit from it. It could see more powerful cultivators, and the development of civilization on the continent would gradually move towards order and prosperity. Eventually, the entire continent would grow into an advanced form that was completely different from what it was now. Chapter 25-27. Time flew by. Tens of thousands of years had passed in the Forbidden Area, or rather, the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. These tens of thousands of years were billions of trillions of years compared to the levels on the continent of the Tall Tower, where time had been distorted. At this time, the entire Spire continent had undergone earth-shattering changes. The Tao ancestor had only completed the task of resonating with two continents in these tens of thousands of years. Although his cultivation realm had made great progress, he was still far from reaching the next stage, which was the level of a 3 tribulation expert. In contrast, the continent had become much more complicated compared to the Forbidden Area tens of thousands of years ago. Each of the continents seemed to have absorbed some kind of nourishment. All of a sudden, all sorts of strange laws that the native cultivators didn't know about appeared. They even gave birth to many extremely strange secret realms, causing the exploration of each continent to skyrocket by more than 10 times. It was also because of this that the Tao ancestor's task of resonating with the continent he was on became more and more difficult. However, although this was an obstacle for the Tao ancestor, it was not the case for the other indigenous cultivators. The more laws they could comprehend on the continent, the more principles and mysteries they could absorb. To them, it obviously meant that they could obtain more things from the outside space-time. This was naturally very useful for their cultivation. Therefore, over the years, many native cultivators in the High Pagoda continent had unknowingly made breakthroughs that they couldn't make in the past. There were even many indigenous cultivators who were not qualified to step into the Tribulation realm. But because of this change, they had become Tribulation realm experts. In contrast to the deep changes in the laws, the landscape of the continents in the continent had also changed greatly. Among them, in the levels where time was distorted, the landscape of the continents became more and more similar to the Tao Master Great World outside the Tao Master's path, which was controlled by the disciples of the true saint. Clearly, the fifth senior brother of the previous generation had spread his tentacles from the first layer of the continent to all the layers where time was distorted in the past billions of years. At this moment, the former fifth senior brother had reached the same level as the Tao ancestor. Not only him, but even Taoist Yuan Zheng had also reached this level at this time. As for their cultivation realms, they had both reached the peak of the second tribulation experts. They had reached the point where they were only one step away from the bottleneck of the 3 tribulation experts. Their realms were almost the same, and there was not much difference. The reason for this coincidence was that the continent where the Tao ancestor was located did not have time distortion. The flow of time here was the same as the flow of time in the forbidden area outside, and it was no different from the fifth level of the Tao Master's path outside. Under such circumstances, even though there was a difference in their starting points, when Taoist Yuan Zheng was stuck in the swamp and unable to extricate himself, the former fifth senior brother was still chasing after him with all his might, leaving him far behind in the dust. In the end, he naturally caught up with Taoist Yuan Zheng, who was in the swamp and could not get out. He also stepped into the swamp of the Taoist Yuan Zheng of the same level as Taoist Yuan Zheng of the continent. In fact, compared to the Tao ancestor, the two of them were in a much better situation. To the Tao ancestor, what he wanted to do now was to gain a basic understanding of the deeper truths and mysteries of this continent from nothing. In the end, he would resonate with these deeper truths and mysteries and obtain the endless truths and mysteries. Then, he would summon the projection of the river of time, distort time, and accelerate the flow of time on the continent to a realm that ordinary living beings could not imagine. This was almost equivalent to opening up a path in a barren land. It went without saying how difficult it would be. In contrast, Taoist Yuan Zheng and the former fifth senior brother were different. For them, because they had already made the continent of the High Tower owe them enough karma, and because they had the knowledge and memories of the fifth tribulation experts, the deep truths and mysteries hidden in the depths of the continent were placed in front of them. They did not need to break through any obstacles at all, and could continue to absorb these truths and mysteries, constantly turning them into the driving force for their cultivation realms to break through. In this way, they did not encounter any bottlenecks at all. As long as they had enough time, they would naturally be able to achieve their goals and naturally advance their cultivation realms to the level of the third tribulation experts. However, compared to the Tao ancestor, they also had a problem. That was, the time they needed was far longer than the time needed for the Tao ancestor to resonate with the continent. In fact, it was many times longer. Based on the Tao ancestor's ability, if he wanted to resonate with the continent, it would take him a few thousand years, or at most tens of thousands of years. However, if the two of them wanted to absorb the deep truths and mysteries, they would need at least hundreds of millions of years. In other words, it was impossible for them to leave this layer before the Tao ancestor. They could only obediently wait for the Tao ancestor to distort the time on this layer and speed up the flow of time. Only then would they have enough time to complete their cultivation on this layer. Therefore, it could be predicted that the gap between them would become smaller and smaller in the following time. Their progress would also be in sync with the Tao ancestors. It was as if they were merely the Tao ancestors' followers and disciples. One day, Taoist Yuan Zheng lamented to the former fifth senior brother, "It's a pity that even though the two of us are very similar to the native cultivators, we can't completely replace the native cultivators in terms of resonance." At this moment, the two of them were standing on a mountain peak that was quite far away from the Tao ancestor, watching him cultivate from afar. Because the Tao ancestor was here, and there were already quite a few of his disciples surrounding him to protect him. Among them, most of the disciples were one or two realms lower than the Tao ancestor, but there were also one or two disciples who were in the same realm as the Tao ancestor. In other words, they were also experts who had undergone the second tribulation. Under such circumstances, not to mention that Taoist Yuan Zheng and the former fifth senior brother did not have the mood to disturb the Tao ancestor. Even if they wanted to do something, it would be very troublesome and difficult for them to do as they pleased. Although they were much stronger than ordinary experts who had undergone the second tribulation, if they really fought on this continent, it would definitely cause an earth-shattering disaster. It might even affect the entire continent of the Tall Pagoda. When that happened, it was hard to say what the ruler of the Forbidden Land would do. Isn't this normal? Why would those indigenous cultivators need to calculate karma as painstakingly as us? The former fifth senior brother said faintly. Originally, if they could resonate with this continent, the resonance would appear as soon as they set foot on this continent. After all, their understanding of the deep principles and mysteries contained in this continent was completely natural, and there were no obstacles at all. As long as they could see it, they would naturally be able to obtain it. In other words, they were born with the understanding of the deep principles and mysteries. In this way, it was equivalent to completely skipping the painstaking process of understanding that the Tao ancestor had to go through before resonating with the continent. Naturally, they would be able to complete the resonance with the continent as soon as they set foot on a certain continent. However, it was obvious that things did not develop in this way. Although most of their performance was no different from the indigenous cultivators, in this aspect, they were completely outsiders. None of the continents showed any signs of resonating with them. No matter which continent they entered, they could at most comprehend the deep principles and mysteries contained in it. They could forget about resonating with it. It was precisely because of this that they needed to wait for the Tao ancestor and follow behind him to break through the continents one by one. Perhaps it's because you didn't submit enough world structures, the former fifth senior brother suddenly said to Taoist Yuanzheng. Upon hearing this, Taoist Yuanzheng shook his head and said, "That's not the reason. If that was the reason, I would have sensed it. Besides, even if that was the reason, I wouldn't dare to do anything." When the former fifth senior brother heard this, he could not help but sigh. Indeed, they were not indigenous cultivators who were born and raised in the tall pagoda continent. To them, there was still an incomparably powerful existence staring at them from above. The purpose of that existence was obviously not for them to turn the tables and push the indigenous cultivators of the tall pagoda continent down from being the main characters. To that existence, they were merely test subjects and pathfinders. Under such circumstances, they could only honestly experiment with all kinds of methods and explore paths one by one. If they made any other moves, it would be considered improper. They did not even need to think about it to know the consequences. As the two of them spoke, they no longer had any interest in continuing the conversation. They sighed and bid farewell to each other before leaving the place. At the core of the Forbidden Land, Luo Fan watched everything quietly. Suddenly, he felt the Forbidden Land tremble slightly. It was as if some kind of existence had suddenly appeared in the Forbidden Land out of thin air. Following the appearance of this existence, the time and space in the Forbidden Land suddenly froze, as if an invisible hand had suddenly pressed the pause button on time. This feeling is at the sixth layer's cultivator descending against time. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and an inexplicable expression appeared on his face. At this moment, he sensed a cultivator appearing out of thin air somewhere in the Forbidden Land. This cultivator had the appearance of a middle-aged woman. However, there was not a single trace of aura emerging from her body. As for existences like the light of heaven and earth, there was not even the slightest bit of it. It felt as if an ordinary middle-aged woman had appeared out of thin air in the Forbidden Land. After the middle-aged woman appeared, her gaze locked onto Luo Fan's location without any hesitation. Luo Fan was shrouded by her gaze. He smiled and said, "Since you're here to see me, why don't you come closer?" The middle-aged woman's expression changed slightly when she heard this. She smiled and said, "It's already presumptuous of me to suddenly visit you. It would be too impolite of me to come directly to you." As she spoke, the feeling of time pausing completely disappeared. Then, with a sway of her body, she had already silently crossed more than half of the forbidden area and appeared directly in front of Luo Fan. She did not leak any aura from her body, nor did she leak any power. She was like a mortal, but the endless light around her did not affect her at all. It felt as if the endless light was in a completely different time and space from her, a completely different dimension. This situation made Luo Fan's heart tremble. After all, even he had to completely refine the Forbidden Land before he could not be affected by the endless light. Other cultivators, including the previous fifth senior brother, needed to rely on their own light of heaven and earth to move freely in the Forbidden Land. However, the middle-aged woman in front of him did not need to rely on any other power to completely ignore the intense light in the Forbidden Land. For a moment, he did not know how mysterious this ability was. However, Luo Fan was not the least bit unhappy about this. On the contrary, he was secretly looking forward to it. This method was obviously brought about by the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. If he could understand the mystery of this method, he might be able to understand the cultivation focus of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, and he would also understand the direction of his breakthrough. Jiayu greets you, Taoist friend. The middle-aged woman bowed to Luo Fan and said, "It turns out to be Fairy Jiayu. I'm Luo Fan. Nice to meet you." Luo Fan just smiled slightly and did not say anything like, "Since you're here, you should know my name." Instead, he honestly introduced himself according to the etiquette. "You're welcome, Taoist friend. This time, I'm here to ask for your help. I hope you can open the continent of the tower to my son." Fairy Jia, you went straight to the point. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled slightly and thought to himself, as expected, when the middle-aged woman appeared in front of him, he had already guessed that the other party's intention should be the continent of the tower. Now that the other party said this, it obviously confirmed his guess. Chapter 25-28. Fairy Jiayu sighed and said, "You'll know when you see it." As she spoke, she waved her hand, and the feeling of time and space stagnating appeared in front of her again. Soon after, in this stagnation, an unknown number of densely packed worlds appeared. The number of these worlds was so large that even Luo Fan couldn't help but be secretly amazed. There are all kinds of strange worlds. Although they did not include all the types of worlds that Luo Fan had seen before, the number of worlds was already the most that he had seen from other cultivators. The levels of these worlds were not ordinary either. In the boundless universe, there was even a world that was almost perfect. Luo Fan naturally knew that Fairy Jiayu did not want him to see these worlds, but a certain cultivator in that world. This was Fairy Jiayu's son. Although Fairy Jiayu did not directly point out which world her son was in and which one it was. However, Luo Fan did not need her guidance at all at this time. He only scanned the world with his perception and instantly locked onto a certain world. He even locked onto a cultivator who had reached the peak of the pseudo-sage stage. "I see. I really can't delay any longer." He could not help but sigh. The reason why he was able to instantly lock onto that world and that cultivator was because Fairy Jiayu was right in front of him at this moment. The blood connection between mother and son was so subtle that even ordinary people could sense it. Moreover, Luo Fan was someone who had already passed the 6th tribulation. To him, even if there were billions of times more worlds, he would definitely be able to lock onto the cultivator who was connected to Fairy Jiayu's bloodline, let alone so many worlds. As for why he knew that Fairy Jiayu could not delay any longer after discovering that cultivator. Even if the continent of the tall tower only verified half of it, it was not certain whether it would be able to achieve its goal in the end. The reason why she had no choice but to come was obvious to him at a glance. For ordinary cultivators, the pseudo-sage stage was already the peak and the ultimate goal of their life. Once he succeeded, he would be able to brag about it for billions of years. However, for existences at Luo Fan's level, and even for existences like Fairy Jiayu, the False Saint realm was merely a foundation that had just been forged. Since it was about forging the foundation, then how to forge it was crucial. If this foundation was forged in a sector, it might not be a burden to a false sage. However, once he broke through, there would obviously be a huge hidden danger. In the end, becoming a false sage still required one to entrust oneself to the outside world. Through this kind of entrustment, one would be able to make a huge leap in one's realm and finally surpass the false sage stage, possessing various prowess similar to that of a true sage. Under such circumstances, if there was an abnormality in the heaven and earth that he had entrusted himself to, and his essence was lacking, it would naturally cause the upgrade to be incomplete. In the end, it would definitely have a huge impact on his future improvement. In comparison, if the external world was perfect enough, such as an existence at the level of a perfect world, then the situation would be different. Because the external world was incomparably perfect, it would cause the improvement of one's realm to be perfect, and there would be no hidden dangers left behind. This was obviously extremely important for cultivators who were ambitious to reach a higher level. Obviously, Fairy Jiayu would not sit back and watch as her son was only at the false sage stage. Her expectation was that her son would be able to catch up to her and follow her on the path to the 6th level of Tao Master. He might even step into the 7th level, the 8th level, the 9th level, and finally become a true sage together. Under this expectation, seeing that her son had already reached the peak of the false sage stage and reached a realm that was difficult to suppress, she naturally could not sit back and watch as he casually chose a world to entrust everything to. Naturally, he needed to find a perfect world that could build a flawless foundation for him to break through. Logically speaking, the most perfect method for her now was actually to release the restrictions on her son and let her son follow the rules of the Tao Master's path, to return to the entrance of the 1st level of the Tao Master's path. The 1st level of the Tao Master's path was enough for cultivators to cultivate to the Tribulation Realm, but this did not mean that only Tribulation Realm experts could stay on the Tao Master's path. As long as one could pass the test of the Tao Master's path, any level of existence, even a false sage, could easily step into it. Of course, it was only the 1st level. If one wanted to break through the 1st level and step into the 2nd level of the Tao Master's path, the standard was obviously not so wide. Any cultivator who wanted to step into the 2nd level of the Tao Master's path would have to raise their realm to the 2nd Tribulation Realm before they could ascend and enter. No matter who it was, no matter what background they had to do so. If Jiayu Fairy's son were to send her son out of the group of worlds she had opened up, then her son would definitely be sent to the entrance of the 1st level of the Tao Master's path by the rules of the Tao Master's path to undergo the test that Luo Fan had gone through. Once he passed the test, he would enter the 1st level of the Tao Master's path, and if he failed, he would fall into the Tao Master Great World, if only for the sake of her son's own development. In fact, this kind of letting go was actually the best choice. However, for Jiayu Fairy, these two situations were obviously unacceptable. She could open up a group of worlds that contained an unknown number of trillions of worlds for her son to travel, and she could watch as her son encountered danger and struggled in it. But she could not watch as her son left her sight. She was currently at the 6th level of the Tao Master's path, and it was already extremely dangerous for her to return to the 5th level. If she was not careful, she might be caught by the Tao Master's prison and be dragged in to be suppressed for hundreds of millions of years. If she was willing to take a greater risk in the 4th level, she would barely be able to explore it with her own eyes. However, the 3rd level, the 2nd level, and the 1st level, even if she were to increase her strength by 10,000 times, it seemed absolutely impossible for her to explore it with her own eyes. Even the first few levels of the Tao Master's path were like this, let alone the Tao Master Great World outside the Tao Master's path. To her, that was a place that she could not pry into at all. Under such circumstances, if her son were to enter the 1st level of the Tao Master's path or enter the Tao Master Great World, it would be equivalent to directly cutting off the connection between her and her son. At that time, no matter what her son had experienced, even if he had died and his soul scattered, she would not be able to know. At that time, the only thing she could do was to wait for her son on the 6th level in vain. Only by grasping the incomparably slim chance of entering the 6th level of the Tao Master's path would she have the chance to see her son again. Even if she was already a 6th tribulation expert, the thought of this situation made Jiayu Fairy's hair stand on end. If she did not know how many billions of years she had waited for her son, then what should she think? Did she want him to be stuck in a certain level because of the lack of opportunities? Or did she want him to collapse halfway because of some bad luck? Or did she want him to ascend in front of her in the next moment? It was obvious that Fairy Jiayu wouldn't just watch things develop to that stage. If it had been before, she could only continue to suppress her son and protect him as long as possible. When she could no longer suppress her son, she would let go of her son as if they were saying goodbye forever and watch him disappear from her life almost forever. This was what her companions had been doing for countless years. And this ultimate fate was also the reason why the cultivators she knew would rather die than have children and not leave any descendants. But not long ago, she saw another possibility. She saw a possibility that could not be separated from her child, could always stay with her child, could watch her child approach her step by step, and finally keep pace with her. That was, in this fifth level, the ruler of a certain forbidden area had opened up a tower continent that could, to a certain extent, replace the Tao Master's path. When she heard this, Jiayu Fairy could not remain calm at once. After confirming that the news was true through various means, she almost cried with joy. After all, even if the effect of this tower continent was much worse than the Tao Master's path, after all, there was still a possibility for her son to grow up under her eyes. This was almost like forcibly keeping her child, who was originally destined to say goodbye to her forever, by her side. How could this not make her feel excited? As for the hidden dangers left behind by the fact that the Spire continent was slightly inferior to the Tao Master's path, as long as one could raise his realm to a high enough level, he would be able to make up for it. Compared to the benefits, this problem that should have been fatal seemed extremely insignificant. Under such circumstances, when she saw that her child was almost unable to suppress his breakthrough, and was about to be unable to suppress himself from placing himself in the world he had opened up, she could not help but directly come to see Luo Fan. Although it was impossible for Luo Fan to know all the various thoughts in Jiayu Fairy's mind, at this time, he did not need her to explain at all to know her purpose. Immediately, he smiled and said, "Sending this little friend to the Tower Continent is naturally not a problem, but have you thought of the price?" Jiayu Fairy said, "Of course I have thought of the price." As she spoke, she pointed with a finger, and a strange, mysterious light appeared out of thin air in front of her, slowly floating towards Luo Fan. Luo Fan's eyes flashed slightly, and he raised his hand to receive the mysterious light. With a slight movement in his heart, he felt an endless amount of information pouring into his heart. It turns out to be an opportunity to participate in the contest for the Land of Opportunity jointly constructed by the 18 Big Worlds. After sorting out the information, Luo Fan could not help but show a look of interest. What was recorded in this information was the situation of participating in a certain Land of Opportunity and the way to compete for the final opportunity. In the introduction of the Land of Opportunity, he could see that the many big worlds were actually inextricably linked. These links were some close and some were distant. Among them, most of the big worlds would have relatively closer big worlds. These big worlds would establish all kinds of strange connections with each other through the means of those big worlds' true saints. In this connection, some of the big worlds would cooperate to open up strange secret realms in the state of chaos. In these secret realms, some of the big worlds would cooperate to open up strange secret realms in the state of chaos. These opportunities were in the state of chaos and could be regarded as a relatively independent state from the many big worlds. Moreover, because it was in the state of chaos, it could be regarded as a relatively independent state from the many big worlds. Therefore, there was no time interval. For example, there would never be something like opening it every few years or something like that. Who was qualified to participate in the contest for the opportunity? Who was qualified to enter the Land of Opportunity? Everything depended on one's own opportunities and one's own luck. And now, what Fairy Jiayu had given to Luo Fan was such an opportunity. This Tao Master Great World was closely connected to the other 17 big worlds. Therefore, these 18 big worlds had jointly opened up a Land of Opportunity in the state of chaos. Any cultivator, as long as they entered the state of chaos in a specific way, could be transported to that Land of Opportunity and compete for that opportunity. And whether they succeeded in competing for the opportunity or failed, in the end, the cultivator could only return to their own big world and could not enter the other big worlds. This price is more than enough. Luo Fan sighed and said. Hearing this, Fairy Jiayu let out a sigh of relief, and the expression on her face relaxed a lot. Now, the deal between her and Luo Fan was not equal at all. For Luo Fan, if the deal failed, he would only lose a chance to enter the strange Land of Opportunity. But for her, if the deal failed, it would mean that her son would have to say goodbye to her forever. The contribution that the two of them had to bear was not equal at all, and she naturally did not have any confidence in front of Luo Fan. If Luo Fan was really not satisfied, she could only think of another way to satisfy his appetite. As for falling out and fighting, that was even more impossible. After all, the continent of the Spire was Luo Fan's doing. If she really angered Luo Fan, he would directly destroy the continent of the Spire, and her last hope would be destroyed. Even if it was just to spend more time with her son, she had to hold it in. Fortunately, the situation did not develop to the worst, and the Taoist fellow in front of her still had a sense of propriety. Chapter 25-29. Luo Fan obviously had no intention of going to the land of opportunity. After all, cultivation was not something that could be accomplished in one go. The most important thing for him now was to deal with the matters of the High Tower continent. One had to know that he could gain some kind of subtle understanding almost at every moment in the High Tower continent. As long as he continued, the benefits he could gain from it would not be much less than what he had gained from the land of opportunity. Not to mention, there would definitely be many other cultivators from this level or the next level coming to trade with him because of the High Tower continent. The benefits it represented would be incomparably amazing. Under such circumstances, unless he was out of his mind, it was impossible for him to leave the High Tower continent aside to pursue the illusory land of opportunity that was jointly constructed by the 18 large worlds. This was especially so when entering the land of opportunity was not affected by time at all, and it did not matter when one entered it. At that moment, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "Fellow Taoist, you have been watching for a long time, so you must have some understanding of the restrictions of the High Tower continent. I won't waste any more time. Please." Jiayu Fairy did not show any unusual expression, obviously agreeing with Luo Fan's Book of Buddha. She had indeed seen many of the developments in the High Spire continent, and she was very clear about the restrictions the High Spire continent imposed on foreign cultivators. At this moment, she smiled faintly and said, "I'm sorry." After saying that, she waved her hand, and the world group suddenly collapsed, instantly turning into a stream of light that wrapped around her son, who was also the cultivator with the bloodline of Jiayu Fairy, whom Luo Fan had recognized before. Then, the stream of light wrapped around the cultivator's endless light that cut through the forbidden area and rushed straight to the High Tower continent in the distance. Jiayu Fairy came from the 6th level of the Dao Master's path, and there was no need to say much about her power and methods. For the cultivators on the 5th level, the forbidden area needed the protection of the embryonic form of the world's light. But for her, she could easily do it by using a trace of her power. The endless light of the Forbidden Land could not stop the brilliance at all. It allowed the brilliance to penetrate the vast area of the Forbidden Land in an instant and rush into the continent of the Tall Tower. In the end, all the light trembled slightly and instantly converged, entering the cultivator's body. Clearly, even though she had turned the world cluster into energy, she was worried that her son would die because of her friend in the world cluster. So, she had fused the entire world cluster into the cultivator's body so that he would not completely collapse. Also, the cultivator would not completely lose those world group. This kind of consideration would only appear when a mother was with her child. After doing this, Fairy Jiayu bowed to Luo Fan, lifted her foot, and lightly stepped forward. Her figure disappeared without a trace. Of course, this was only in the eyes of ordinary cultivators. In Luo Fan's eyes, he could clearly see that Fairy Jiayu had turned into an invisible existence and appeared outside the continent of the Tall Tower. She had been staring at her son who was on the 1st floor of the continent of the Tall Tower. "I have to form karma first before I can cultivate. How troublesome." The moment Goddess Jiayu's son appeared on the 1st level, his mother's words echoed in his mind. He knew exactly where he was and what he had to do next. "However, I can finally cultivate freely. I wonder how long it will take for me to catch up to my mother and my father." The cultivator's eyes shone with longing. His mother was Goddess Jiayu, a cultivator who cultivated on the 6th level of the Tao Sovereign Path. However, his father was not a level 6 cultivator, but a level 7 cultivator on the path of Tao Master. His parents had been cultivating on the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. In fact, he himself was born in the 6th level. However, due to an accident, his father had no choice but to ascend to the 7th level. He could only occasionally descend to the 6th level through some loopholes to meet with the mother and son. Every time he came, he had to be sneaky and could only stay for a few years before he had to go back. The mother and son had long had enough of this situation. In fact, if they had not been separated from his father, they would not have such a strong pursuit of cultivation. After all, although their cultivation realm was not enough, they had transcended the limit of lifespan. Even if they thought they were extraordinary, they knew that the possibility of becoming a true sage and becoming a Tao Master was very small. Under such circumstances, if everything went smoothly in this realm, there was obviously not much need for further breakthroughs. However, it was obvious that this was not the case for the mother and son. After losing his father, their lives were like missing a piece. The longer they lived, the more painful and torturous it would be. For the sake of their family reunion, they had to work so hard. The cultivator looked around, and his eyes flickered. His perspective instantly changed from a normal perspective to a karma perspective. At a glance, the entire world seemed to have been formed by an infinite amount of karma. As expected, all the karma is getting restless and could pounce on me at any time. The cultivator sighed. The karma in the entire continent of the Tall Tower was extremely heavy and active. It felt as if as long as he did something, he could trigger the karma and drown him, making him unable to reincarnate. His mother had already explained the current situation to him very clearly. At this time, he did not directly place himself in the outside world to become a false sage as he wished. Instead, he first emitted all kinds of indescribable auras that continuously integrated into the surrounding void. These auras were extremely mysterious and wonderful. They contained all kinds of wonderful rules and laws, as well as all kinds of indescribable principles and mysteries. As these auras integrated, the continent gradually began to tremble subtly. The entire continent seemed to have suddenly come to life at this moment and began to change in a manner similar to breathing. Even the size of the continent itself, the rules and laws of the continent itself, and the various mysteries contained within them all grew subtly during this process. With this change, an indescribable feeling emerged in the cultivator's heart. In this feeling, he seemed to have become the ruler of this continent, as if everything in this continent was under his control. I've succeeded. Sensing all of this and looking at the endless karma around him, the cultivator came to a realization. At this moment, his various feelings meant that the world was already owing him more and more karma. The information that he had poured into the surrounding void just now did not come from the cultivator himself, but from his mother. It came from Fairy Jiayu from the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. There was naturally no need to mention the mysteries of this information. More importantly, it contained a certain mystery of the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. This mystery was obviously of great significance to the continent of the Tall Tower on the 5th level. It was enough to break through the obstacles that couldn't be broken through using the mysteries of the 5th level, allowing the continent to grow to a whole new stage. The significance of this was self-evident. One could only imagine how much karma the Spire continent owed to the cultivator who had allowed it to grow so much and infused all this information into the Spire continent. In just a few days, the cultivator had already felt that the karma that the Spire continent owed him was more than enough for him to become a false saint. I can finally break through. Sensing the changes in the karma, the cultivator could not help but be filled with excitement. One must know that he had been suppressed for billions of years at the peak of the false saint realm. After such a long time, even if he was happy to be with his mother, his cultivation instinct still made him feel rather regretful. Now that he could finally break through this bottleneck that he had been suppressing for countless years and could finally satisfy his desire to cultivate, one could imagine how excited he was. At this moment, the karma that the continent of the tall tower owed him continued to increase. Clearly, the benefits that the aura that he poured into the continent brought to the continent continued to increase as time passed. This was the only way for such a situation to occur. However, for the cultivator who was eager to break through to the false saint realm, this was nothing. At this moment, he slowly spread out his body according to the method that he had deduced countless times and slowly connected himself with the surrounding space-time. As he moved, the bottleneck that suppressed him below the false saint realm began to gradually collapse. His cultivation realm began to leap for the first time in billions of years. In a trance, he was already immersed in this incomparably wonderful feeling. His perception of himself, his perception of space, and his perception of time had all unknowingly disappeared without a trace. After an unknown period of time, his heart trembled, and his body that had been completely scattered condensed once again. The various senses that had completely disappeared returned in an instant, allowing him to completely return to his normal state. As for his cultivation realm, he had already completely stepped into the false saint stage. It was a realm that he had always dreamed of reaching. "I've finally succeeded," the cultivator murmured. At the same time, outside the continent of the tall tower, Fairy Jiayu also murmured. However, the tone of the two was somewhat different. To that cultivator, his current mood was one of excitement, joy, and excitement. It was a kind of joy that what he had been looking forward to for countless years had finally become a reality. On the other hand, Fairy Jiayu's feelings were rather complicated. Although there was also joy, there was more of a sense of melancholy. These two emotions intertwined, causing her expression to become rather complicated. There was naturally no need to say much about her joy. Her son had finally made progress again after countless billions of years, so how could she not feel happy? As for the melancholy, it was also quite obvious. Becoming a false saint in the continent of the tall tower meant that he had already cut off his path of retreat. Next, her son's fate would be tied to the continent of the tall tower. Whether her son could really catch up to her, or even her Tao companion in the future, would depend on the situation of the continent of the tall tower. As for the continent of the tall tower, it was not in her hands. How could she not feel melancholy? After a long time, Fairy Jiayu's eyes narrowed as this thought flashed through her mind. Next, anyone who wants to destroy this continent will have to do so over my dead body. Looks like he has succeeded. Next, the continent of the tall tower will be impregnable. In the center of the forbidden area, Luo Fan also felt relaxed at this moment. After all, this Fairy Jiayu was his first customer. Although he had already received the reward for the transaction, he could not completely ignore it before the final result was revealed. Now that Fairy Jiayu's son had completed the first step of the breakthrough, it meant that the first step of the development was quite smooth, and it also meant that from now on, Fairy Jiayu would become the firmest guardian of the tall tower continent. How could he not feel relaxed? Next, I just need to see if he can successfully step into the 5th level. If he succeeds, I will have no worries from now on. Then he thought of something. Fairy Jiayu was an expert from the 6th level of the Tao Master's Path. Although it was against the rules of the Tao Master's Path, because she came against the rules. Once the news was leaked, it would definitely attract the power of the Tao Master's prison. At that time, she would definitely be suppressed. However, a 6th tribulation expert was still a 6th tribulation expert. The existence of Fairy Jiayu itself was already a great deterrent. Any cultivator, whether it was a Tao Master's disciple or a rogue cultivator, who wanted to target the tall tower continent must first obtain Fairy Jiayu's permission. This was enough to completely brush off most of the people who had evil intentions. Not to mention, once Fairy Jiayu's son successfully stepped into the 5th level, his existence itself would be a huge advertisement. Those cultivators who were interested in this business would definitely come in droves. And every cultivator who participated would naturally follow in Fairy Jiayu's footsteps and be similarly tied to the tall tower continent. If this continued, there was naturally no need to worry about the safety of the tall tower continent. On the continent of the Spire, Fairy Jiayu's son was still cultivating. Chapter 25:30. Time flew by. Unknowingly, hundreds of thousands of years had passed outside the continent of the tower. These hundreds of thousands of years were billions of years for the layers of continents inside the continent of the tower, where time was distorted. After such a long time, Jiayu Fairy's son had unknowingly raised his cultivation realm to the level of a tribulation expert, and his position had unknowingly caught up with the Tao ancestor, Taoist Yuan Zheng, the former fifth senior brother and a middle-aged cultivator who was looking for his son. In other words, he had unknowingly left the area where time was distorted and arrived at the layer where the flow of time was the same as the outside world. This obviously meant that his rapid cultivation speed over the past hundreds of thousands of years had finally slowed down again. I didn't expect it to be so smooth. At this time, Jiayu Fairy, who was outside the continent of the tower, had a look of joy in her eyes. Her son had raised his cultivation realm from false saint to the level of a tribulation expert in just hundreds of thousands of years. This huge improvement made her extremely happy. At this moment, she was extremely glad that she had made a deal with Luo Fan. Although she had not seen the final result of her son becoming a tribulation expert and directly leaving the continent of the tower to appear in front of her, she was already satisfied with what she had gained. After all, even if her son had left the continent of the tower, he would no longer have to start from the first layer of the Tao Master's path. He could directly start from the third layer. Although it was still not the fifth level, nor was it the sixth level that she was on, it was still barely within her reach. At least, she would have a chance to step into the third layer in hundreds of millions of years to meet her son. Moreover, although her son could no longer break through as quickly as he had in the past hundreds of thousands of years, but the whole cultivation process was still very smooth. At present, there was no problem with the structure and function of the entire continent of the tower. In other words, as long as there was enough time, her son would eventually be able to walk to the end and finally transcend the continent of the tower and directly appear in front of her. To her, what was time? No matter how many billions of years it would take, as long as there was hope, she would quietly wait. Based on the previous speed, it would only take a few tens of millions of years for the time of all levels of the Spire continent to be completely distorted. When that time comes, my child will be able to transcend the continent and appear before me in a very short time. Jiayu thought to herself, her eyes sparkling. At this moment, a strange aura suddenly pushed aside the light and appeared out of nowhere in this forbidden area. The intensity of the light in this forbidden area was tens of thousands of times stronger than that of the normal fifth floor of the road to Tao Master outside. For normal cultivators on the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, that is, experts of the five tribulations, they could only resist the light by relying on the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, or even a large number of disciples of heaven and earth. As for Jiayu Fairy, who was a six tribulations expert, although she did not need the light of heaven and earth to resist the light in this forbidden area, she could only be unaffected by it. After all, she could not manipulate the light at will. However, at this moment, this aura that appeared out of nowhere directly manipulated the light in this forbidden area like it was made of plasticine, so that in the blink of an eye, the forbidden area had already been forcibly emptied out. Even Luo Fan could not help but be secretly shocked at this kind of means. This is definitely not the means of a six tribulations expert. At this moment, Luo Fan came to such a realization. Although it was just an aura, and it was extremely restrained, with no aura leaking out at all, just the natural behavior of this aura when it appeared was enough for him to see this. At this moment, Jiayu Fairy's expression changed slightly, as if she could not believe it, and also seemed to feel inexplicably wronged. How did you get the news? She paused for a long time before speaking to the aura. At this moment, the aura condensed slightly and turned into the figure of a young cultivator. The young cultivator had an ordinary appearance, but there was absolute confidence between his brows, a kind of confidence that seemed to ignore everything. Under the reflection of this confidence, his originally ordinary appearance was actually filled with indescribable charm. Appearing here, it seemed that even the surrounding forbidden areas could not help but obey him. The young cultivator sighed and said, My son suddenly improved so much in such a short period of time. How could I not feel it? At this moment, Luo Fan's figure had already appeared in front of the two of them out of thin air. Or rather, in front of the person and the aura. After carefully looking at this young cultivator, Luo Fan clearly recognized his essence. Although he looked like a real cultivator, in fact, this young cultivator in front of him was only formed by an aura. Perhaps he carried a bit of the young cultivator's will. As if the young cultivator was here in person, he could respond to the young cultivator and transmit all kinds of information back to the young cultivator's main body. But in the end, he was still just an aura. At this moment, the young cultivator formed by the aura bowed to Luo Fan and apologized. My level is too high, so I can't come with my real body. Thank you for taking care of my wife and son. I hope you can forgive me. Luo Fan sighed and said, I didn't expect to alarm a fellow Taoist on the 7th level and above. Fellow Taoist is too humble. Although I only came because I sensed the change in my bloodline. In fact, there have already been countless rumors on the 7th level. Right now, there are probably a lot of fellow Taoists waiting for the result of this matter. The cultivator smiled and said, they can slowly wait, but don't you know your son? You actually let a woman like me go through all this trouble. Jiayu Fairy was quite resentful at this moment. The young cultivator smiled bitterly at Luo Fan, looking extremely helpless. At this time, Luo Fan was quite clear about his difficulties. One had to know that if a cultivator on the upper level of the Tao Sovereign Path wanted to influence the situation on the lower level of the Tao Sovereign Path, he would have to risk being suppressed for billions of trillions of years. Not to mention that he was separated by 2 levels of the Tao Sovereign Path. It could be said that if one's means were not high enough, it would be impossible to influence the situation on this level with 2 levels of the Tao Sovereign Path. Even if one could influence it, the risk required was great, and the loss would definitely not be worth it. If being separated by 1 level could only mean being suppressed for billions of trillions of years, then being separated by 2 levels, if something went wrong, the result might even be that one's life would be lost. Under such circumstances, unless it was necessary, how could this young cultivator intervene in the matters of the 5th level from the 7th level? It could be said that this time, if it wasn't for the fact that his wife and son had already come to this 5th level, he probably wouldn't have risked the danger of never being able to reincarnate to appear here. At this time, Luo Fan's eyes suddenly flashed, and he suddenly found that the appearance of the Jiayu Fairy had begun to change subtly. Originally, when she first appeared in front of him, she clearly looked like a middle-aged woman. However, after the young cultivator appeared, she became younger and younger, as if she was growing in reverse. Now, she had the appearance of a young girl, and she looked a few years younger than the young cultivator. And her appearance, in contrast, was several times more exquisite. From an ordinary middle-aged woman, she had become a goddess who was loved by millions. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan couldn't help but secretly sigh in his heart. For an existence at the level of Luo Fan, there was naturally no need to say much about his vast knowledge. As soon as he saw the change in the woman's appearance, he knew the fundamental reason behind it. This wasn't because the Jiayu Fairy had deliberately changed her appearance when she met him before. There was no need for that at all. At their level, whether the appearance was good or bad didn't have any effect at all, and any changes for existences at their level were also obvious at a glance. In this way, changing her appearance would only be superfluous, and it might even make things worse. Therefore, the Jiayu Fairy definitely wouldn't change her appearance when she met Luo Fan. In other words, the appearance of the middle-aged woman at that time was indeed her true appearance. At that time, she really had the appearance of a middle-aged woman. And the situation at this time was also similar. At this time, the change in the appearance of the Jiayu Fairy was also not just made changes to her own appearance. She deliberately changed her appearance to that of this goddess. Instead, it was her appearance that had truly become like this. In other words, the appearance of this goddess in front of him was also her true appearance. This situation seemed inconceivable at first glance. But in fact, as long as one thought about it, the reason behind it was clear. The reason why the true appearance of the Jiayu Fairy had such a change was that her heart had changed. Before, the Jiayu fairy almost put all her thoughts on her son, and what she paid attention to with all her heart was her son. Under such circumstances, her heart was the heart of a mother. This mentality filled her with a strong sense of motherhood, and her perception of her own status and her understanding of her husband were inclined to be that of a mother and a father. Under such circumstances, the appearance was born from the heart, and naturally her appearance naturally turned into the appearance of a middle-aged woman, unknowingly. But at this time, the situation was already completely different. At this time, the situation of her son's situation was really on the right track. As long as it developed normally, her son would eventually be able to meet her greatest expectations and step into the same level of Tao Master as her, cultivate with her, make progress together, ascend together, and even become Tao Masters together. Under such circumstances, naturally, her worry for her son was greatly reduced. And with less worry, the focus of survival would naturally shift back to herself. In addition, at this time, her husband, the cultivator who had already gone to the 7th level of Tao Master, appeared in front of her again, and her mentality naturally changed from the mentality of a mother to the mentality of a wife, the mentality of a lover, and even the mentality of a young girl. In this way, the appearance was born from the heart, and her appearance naturally became that of a young girl. The young cultivator clearly saw this, and there was a hint of joy in his eyes. This showed that his wife had already put down the biggest burden in her heart, and from now on, she would be able to live a more relaxed life. How could this not make him feel happy? At this time, the young cultivator smiled at Luo Fan and said, "This time, I have a request." At this time, the young cultivator just smiled and said to Luo Fan, "Fellow Taoist, please speak." He did not agree, nor did he say that he did not agree. After all, although the young cultivator in front of him had already stepped into the 7th level of Tao Master and was considered a 7th tribulation expert, at the end of the day, what appeared here at this time was only a trace of his aura. Even if it was quite strong, the threat it posed to him was quite limited. Under such circumstances, naturally, he did not need to worry too much about the pressure that the other party would bring to him. If the other party's idea did not affect him, then it was not a big deal to agree. However, if the other party's idea had some impact on him, then obviously The young cultivator also knew what Luo Fan meant and said, "With your ability, it should not be difficult for you to distort time, right? At the current speed, if my son wants to transcend, it will take tens of millions of years, although it is already very fast. However, after all, I came here against the flow of time, and I can't stay for too long. After all, tens of millions of years is still too long for me. If I have your help to distort time, then the situation will be different. At that time, it will only take hundreds of thousands of years to end, and I will also be able to see my son transcend with my own eyes. I wonder if you can help me?" Hearing this, Luo Fan suddenly understood the cultivator's meaning. Although it was only a trace of aura, it was, after all, going against the flow of 2 levels of Tao Master. For the young cultivator in front of him, this was obviously an extremely difficult thing. With his means, obviously, it was already his limit to last for hundreds of thousands of years. If he wanted to last for tens of millions of years, it would be beyond his strength. Chapter 25:31. Hearing the cultivator's words, Luo Fan only shook his head and said, "Although I understand, it's a pity that I can't agree." The young cultivator's expression froze when he heard this. The young cultivator originally thought that since he came from the 7th level of the Tao Master's path, he would immediately agree to such a small request that would not cause any harm to the other party. However, he did not expect that the other party would directly reject him after he had said so much. Moreover, his words were resolute and merciless. Even though the young cultivator thought that he had a good temper and never put on airs, he could not help but feel displeased. "What do you mean, fellow Taoist? You won't lose anything by doing this, will you?" The young cultivator suppressed the displeasure in his heart and said. He had to ask for Luo Fan's help in the end. Luo Fan said lightly, I'm afraid that fellow Taoist doesn't understand my tall pagoda continent. I didn't create this continent just for other Taoists to send their children there. In other words, compared to my real intention, letting other Taoists send their children there is just a convenience. If I really do as fellow Taoist says, my other ideas about this tall pagoda continent will be completely useless. From now on, this tall pagoda continent can only be used as a kindergarten for other Taoists to raise their children. The young cultivator's expression stiffened when he heard this. After a long time, he could only sigh. He thought that he had a good temper, but it was not just his own opinion. His temper was really quite good. In the end, he couldn't bring himself to ask others to completely destroy their own cultivation in order to satisfy his own needs. Even if he thought that his strength was countless times stronger than Luo Fan's, he still couldn't do such a thing. Therefore, at this time, after hearing Luo Fan's reason, he found that he could not think of any reason to ask Luo Fan to do as he wanted. After sighing, he could only say, "In that case, we can only forget about this matter." Luo Fan sighed and said, "I see that fellow Taoist method is quite clever. It won't be troublesome to come again after tens of millions of years, right?" The young cultivator only smiled bitterly and said, "It's more than difficult to descend 2 levels away from the Tao sovereign realm. The price I pay to descend this time will probably take me hundreds of millions of years to make up for. Descending tens of millions of years later, I'm afraid I can't bear the price." Luo Fan could only shrug his shoulders when he heard this. He couldn't help with this kind of thing. After all, just as he mentioned before, he didn't create the Spire continent just to create a kindergarten. What he needed was the mysteries of the continent. If he really interfered and distorted the time of the continent behind it, it would obviously break the natural system of the continent. At that time, all of his plans might not necessarily collapse, but there was a great danger of them collapsing. In order to satisfy this young cultivator's request, he was clearly unwilling to take such a huge risk. Fairy Jiayu was obviously looking forward to Luo Fan following the young cultivator's instructions. However, it was obvious that she had no confidence in facing Luo Fan at this time. Even if Luo Fan obviously rejected her husband and delayed the time of her son transcending the Spire continent by tens of millions of years, she could only secretly sigh. As for interfering with the Spire continent and distorting the flow of time of the lower levels of the continent, she dared not do such a thing. It wasn't that she couldn't, but she didn't dare to. After all, the Spire continent was so intricate and profound. There were so many secrets that, even after looking at it for hundreds of thousands of years, she still couldn't understand it at all. Why could the Spire continent barely replace the Tao sovereign realm and allow cultivators to step into the Calamity realm? She could see a little of the secret behind it, but most of it was still unclear to her. Under such circumstances, if she made changes to the Spire continent without understanding it, she had no confidence that it wouldn't affect the functioning of the Spire continent. In other words, she had no confidence that after changing the flow of time of the Spire continent would still be able to replace the Tao sovereign realm. Under such circumstances, she could only watch helplessly from the side. The young cultivator sighed. With a sway of his body, he arrived next to Fairy Jiayu and fought with her. He said to Luo Fan, "That's all for now. Next, I want to meet my son in person. I don't think you will stop me, right?" Luo Fan just smiled and said, "You can do as you please, fellow Taoist. I just hope that you won't change anything about the Spire continent. After all, the Spire continent is still not comparable to the Tao sovereign realm. It's rather fragile. If you do anything, you might break the balance and make the Tao sovereign realm's effect disappear." The young cultivator naturally nodded in agreement. "Rest assured, fellow Taoist, I naturally know what's important." As they spoke, the two bowed, turned around, and went to the layer hundreds of floors below the Spire continent, where Fairy Jiayu's son and the Tao ancestor were. Looking at their movements, Luo Fan just smiled faintly, turned around, and returned to the area where he had been staying in the center of the forbidden area. He once again immersed himself in cultivation. He believed that the young cultivator and Fairy Jiayu should know what's important and would not make any changes to the Spire continent. In fact, if there were any outsiders who want to change it, he would stop them. It could be said that if he was a little lazy, he could even temporarily let go of the Spire continent. Fairy Jiayu and her husband entered the Spire continent, but compared to the other outsiders at the level of Fifth Tribulation, they did not appear on the first floor. Instead, they directly appeared in the deepest part of the Spire continent. After all, the rules of the Spire continent itself could not restrain Sixth and Seventh Tribulation experts like them. By directly appearing here, the two of them had different effects on the Spire continent. Fairy Jiayu seemed to be in a completely different dimension from her surroundings. Although her body was here, it seemed like she was just a shadow. It did not cause any changes to the Spire continent at all. Even the essence of the world in the Spire continent was not disturbed in the slightest. In contrast, although the young cultivator was just a body formed from aura, his influence was much greater than Fairy Jiayu's. The moment he entered that layer of the Spire continent trembled slightly. The essence of the world seemed to suddenly boil and began to produce indescribable turbulence. The turbulence was so strong that it felt like the essence of the world suddenly had an additional ruler and was about to be completely controlled by some existence. Sensing this change, the young cultivator's expression changed slightly. For some unknown reason, his sense of existence was extremely low. Immediately after, all of his aura was completely restrained, and he looked completely like Fairy Jiayu, as if he was in a completely different dimension from the Spire continent. It really is so fragile. To be able to maintain such a fragile balance for so many years, this Taoist friend is really extraordinary. The young cultivator sighed at this time. There seems to be some mysterious source supporting the Spire continent below. It is said that it is an opportunity left behind by a Tao master. Fairy Jiayu said at this time. After all, she had stayed here for hundreds of thousands of years. Her understanding of the Spire continent was naturally not something that her husband could compare with. At this time, she knew more than him. An opportunity left behind by a Tao master. The young cultivator sighed as if he had thought of many things and recalled many memories. Obviously, as an existence who could ascend to the 7th level of the Tao master's path, he had obviously experienced countless dangers and obtained countless opportunities. Perhaps there were many opportunities left by the Tao master, just like the last place of opportunity under the continent of the High Pagoda. The child has found us. At this time, Fairy Jiayu's face showed an excited expression. Obviously, even if she had watched from the outside for hundreds of thousands of years, there was still a big difference between seeing her own child in person and seeing him for real. At this time, when she was about to see her own child in person, she still could not suppress her excitement. At this time, the young cultivator's eyes also flickered, and his eyes were quite fluctuating. Obviously, although he appeared indifferent, he was still his son after all. It was difficult for him to keep calm when he was really going to see his son. Soon, the figure of their son broke through the air and appeared in front of them. When he saw that it was really his parents here, the cultivator was also very excited. One must know that when he sensed the blood-related aura appearing on this continent just now, he did not dare to believe his senses and almost suspected that he had an illusion because he cultivated too much. It was because he really missed his parents. Even if the probability was small, he had to investigate first. So he appeared here at this time. Greetings, Father, Mother. The cultivator immediately knelt and choked with sobs. Good. The young cultivator was quite excited at this time, and he even had difficulty controlling his own aura, faintly causing the laws around him to become slightly chaotic, causing the entire Spire continent to tremble slightly. Fortunately, he reacted quickly, and at this time, he had already reacted at this time. He controlled his aura, and the various phenomena caused by his body completely disappeared in an instant. After the young cultivator restrained his aura, he said, "Not bad. To be able to obtain such an improvement in such a short time, it seems that it won't be long before you and I can meet again on the 7th floor. That's right. Our family of 3 will be able to truly reunite soon." Fairy Jiayu's face was also full of excitement at this time. He did not know if it was an illusion, But he felt that Fairy Jiayu seemed to have become more mature than before, and her appearance seemed to be faintly beyond the level of a young girl. Clearly, after seeing her son, her maternal instincts swelled once again, and she once again suppressed the feeling she had for her husband in her heart. Due to the change in mentality, her appearance once again became that of a middle-aged woman. Fortunately, the young cultivator was still by her side, and at this time, her mentality could not completely change back to the state before her husband appeared. Soon, after a slight change, her appearance completely stopped changing. The son saw the change in Fairy Jiayu's appearance, and he was very happy, although his mother did not shift all her attention to him. And because of this, her maternal instincts did not erupt and completely change her appearance. But he did not feel jealous at all. Instead, he was extremely happy. Feelings were mutual, and the deeper the feelings Fairy Jiayu had for her son, the deeper the feelings her son had for her. Fairy Jiayu grew older day by day for her son, and her mentality even became almost to the point of losing herself. For her son, this was naturally seen in his eyes, and his heart ached. At this time, seeing his mother gradually regain herself and gradually shift the center of her life away from him, how could he not feel happy? At this time, he winked at his father. When the young cultivator saw this, he couldn't help but feel ashamed. Although his wife's mentality had temporarily recovered, in the end, he could not stay here forever. He could not always be with his wife. When he left, things would return to the original state, and at that time, his wife's mentality would still be unbalanced. However, there were still hundreds of thousands of years. Although this period of time was short, it was enough for him to make up to his wife. At this moment, he smiled and said, "Now that our family of 3 has such a good opportunity to reunite, we can't waste it. Child, where do you live now? Let your mother and I go take a look." When Fairy Jiayu heard this, she nodded continuously. Although she had looked outside for many years, personally going to her son's cave residence to take a look was still a great temptation for her. Under this temptation, everything else became secondary. Even the fact that her husband could only live for hundreds of thousands of years before he had to leave became insignificant. When the son heard this, he smiled and said, "I was just about to invite father and mother over." As he spoke, he respectfully led Fairy Jiayu and her husband to his cave residence. Chapter 25:32. Time flew by. Hundreds of thousands of years had passed without anyone noticing. On this day, Fairy Jiayu's family of 3 appeared rather solemn on the Spire continent. It was already the last time the young cultivator could stay on the 5th floor. In fact, since tens of thousands of years ago, the young cultivator's aura had become rather blurry. If it wasn't for the fact that the young cultivator's cultivation was too high, it might have dissipated a long time ago and could not take form. However, even with the support of his realm, this was already a great limit. Hundreds of thousands of years, I'm already satisfied with this, the son said. His expression was rather calm. At least it seemed like he was speaking from the bottom of his heart. Although he was a son in front of Fairy Jiayu and her husband, he was just a child. But in fact, even the world that Fairy Jiayu created, the son had cultivated for who knows how many billions of years. In this continent of the Spire continent, he had cultivated for who knows how many trillions of years. Under such circumstances, how could he really be like what his parents thought, that he was really just a child? He was clearly clear about everything, and he was very clear about it. Therefore, he naturally had his own ideas and theories on how to comfort his parents and how to deal with the conflicts during this period. The cultivator from the 7th floor sighed and said, "I'm sorry, I'm still not strong enough. If I was strong enough, perhaps our family of 3 wouldn't have to endure this pain of separation. Don't worry, I'll soon be able to transcend this continent of the Spire continent," the son said. Fairy Jiayu's expression was rather miserable at this moment. She just looked at her husband without saying a word. Cultivation isn't just about accumulating resources. You need to have enough confidence and not be overly arrogant. Although the current environment of the Spire continent gives you a chance to improve, it's still not as good as the path of a Tao master. Don't take it lightly. In the end, the young cultivator said to his son, The cultivation of a Tribulation Realm powerhouse was not smooth sailing. It was luck that his son didn't encounter a bottleneck before, but it didn't mean that there were no bottlenecks later on. At the very least, with the insight of this seven tribulations expert, he could see that there was some restlessness in his son's heart. This restlessness might cause his strength to stagnate one day. Of course, he could only point it out lightly. He couldn't bring it out to talk about. Things like temperament might not change if you don't say it out loud. Once he said it out loud, he would immediately swell up. At that time, it might cause the hidden danger to erupt in the future to erupt now. Only with a light tap could he leave these words in the other party's heart. When the other party encountered the influence of that hidden danger one day, he would remember these words again. At that time, he would be able to obtain some hints. Perhaps these hints would allow him to break through that hidden danger, that obstacle in the process. Hearing this, the son didn't think much of it. He just felt that his father was encouraging him, so he nodded in response. The young cultivator sighed in his heart, but there was nothing else he could say. At that moment, he hugged his wife. Fairy Jia Yu's face was instantly covered in tears. Not long after, the young cultivator's figure completely disappeared without a trace. Fairy Jia Yu's tears gradually stopped after a long time. Then, she said to her son, "Work hard from now on. We've delayed your cultivation by staying here all these years." How is it delayed? Cultivation isn't everything in life. If I don't have father and mother, what's the point of my cultivation? The son smiled. Fairy Jia Yu's expression softened a little. She gave a few words of encouragement and left the continent of the spire. Although her son said so, she was very clear that staying in the continent of the spire would only be a burden to her son. In fact, in the past hundreds of thousands of years, her son had not improved at the original speed. Now, he had fallen behind a lot of the friends he had made these days. If he continued to delay like this, not to mention tens of millions of years, even hundreds of millions or billions of years would not be enough to meet her requirements. After leaving the continent of the spire, Fairy Jia Yu went outside and hid again. Just like before, she watched her son's cultivation while guarding the continent of the spire. After entering the continent of the spire once, she knew how fragile the balance of the continent of the spire was. Although this degree of fragility was not enough to make her regret sending her son there, it also made her realize that her previous protection of the continent of the spire was far from enough. Under such circumstances at this time, she naturally guarded the continent of the spire even more attentively. Tens of thousands of years after the aura of the Seven Tribulation Powerhouse disappeared, one day, an aura descended from the sky and rushed straight towards where Luo Fan was. This aura was so wonderful, it felt somewhat similar to when the young cultivator descended from the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, in terms of fierceness, this aura was even better. When it descended, it created an unimaginable pressure on the forbidden area, causing the entire forbidden area to almost boil, as if there was an endless amount of heat being poured into the entire forbidden area. Under this kind of turbulence, many cultivators who were originally entering the forbidden area through the explored safe route to enter the continent of the spire lost their safe route and were engulfed by the chaotic and boiling light. They don't come with good intentions. At this time, Luo Fan frowned, and this thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, as his light of heaven and earth surged, countless roots stretched out and instantly enveloped the entire forbidden area. As the roots enveloped the entire forbidden area, the chaos caused by the arrival of the aura completely calmed down in an instant. The entire forbidden area looked calmer and more stable than before. It was as if it had been completely solidified. With this change, the power produced by the arrival of the aura began to condense towards where Luo Fan was from all directions, constantly acting on the light of heaven and earth that was as clear as water behind Luo Fan, causing the light of heaven and earth to tremble subtly during this process. However, this was only a subtle tremble. Even for the light of heaven and earth itself, this change did not cause any damage to it, let alone Luo Fan himself, who was protected by the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the aura had truly materialized not far from Luo Fan. With a slight turn, it turned into the appearance of a young cultivator with a dark red face. This young cultivator with a dark red face was surrounded by an extremely sharp aura. The surrounding light constantly trembled under this aura, and at every moment, there seemed to be countless light completely collapsing and disappearing. So you're the ant that helped Hsien Puppy's son cultivate? The dark red cultivator looked at Luo Fan with a face as cold as ice. He looked at Luo Fan coldly and said, Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned and said, Ant. As he spoke, he did not hesitate to raise his hand and slap at the dark red cultivator in front of him. With this slap, the boundless concept spell formed a light similar to the light of the world. It mercilessly charged toward the cultivator with the dark red face. It was like the world crushing an ant, and it mercilessly crushed the cultivator. You're overestimating yourself. The dark red cultivator just sneered. Without any movement, Luo Fan's attack had completely collapsed. It was as if there was an invisible force field that had completely crushed his concept divine ability. Even if Luo Fan had condensed his concept divine ability to form a structure similar to the light of heaven and earth through various subtle combinations, it still didn't have the slightest ability to resist this invisible force field. It was as if this concept divine ability, which could destroy everything in the world and even affect the state of chaos, was just like tofu. Is this the technique of a cultivator from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan's eyes flashed with excitement. He did not have the anger and other negative emotions that should have arisen when his attack was crushed by his opponent. For Luo Fan, he thought that he had enough means to save his life. As long as he could not penetrate the level and erase his corresponding existence in the countless levels at the same time, his life would not be in danger. Under such circumstances, he only hoped that the opponent he encountered was not strong enough, but he did not worry that his opponent would kill him because he was too strong. The stronger the opponent, the more difficult it would be for him to deal with, but at the same time, the more powerful the opponent was, the more he could clearly feel the higher level of the opponent's means. Die. The cultivator with a dark red face said indifferently. As he said this, he raised his hand and grasped at the void where Luo Fan was. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that there was an invisible existence wrapped around his body and all his existence in this level, including the light of heaven and earth, his body protected by the light of heaven and earth, his will, his spirit, his life origin, and so on. Everything, as long as Luo Fan could think of it, was completely wrapped up by this invisible existence. Moreover, this kind of wrapping was not a whole wrapping, but a kind of wrapping that was independent of everything. In other words, for this invisible existence, the life origin protected by the spirit protected by the body protected by the light of heaven and earth, and even the internal space-time within the body, and so on, everything was independent of each other to face this invisible existence. The relationship of protecting each other did not exist at all for this invisible existence. Under such circumstances, the invisible existence did not need to pass through the light of heaven and earth to directly attack Luo Fan's body. It did not need to pass through his body to attack his spirit, and it did not need to pass through his spirit to directly attack his life origin, the life origin that had been transformed into a manifestation of the worldview of laws. All defenses and protections seemed to be completely meaningless in the face of this special attack. At this moment, the invisible existence suddenly squeezed inwards. An incomparably terrifying power acted on everything in Luo Fan's body in a parallel and independent manner. Pooh! 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 At this moment, Luo Fan's body completely exploded, leaving only the light of heaven and earth deformed slightly before recovering. Apart from that, everything else had been completely turned into fragments. Moreover, these fragments were still constantly exploding, shattering, and decomposing. Finally, they gradually turned into nothingness and disappeared without a trace. Not bad light of heaven and earth, but to pity that master is too weak. The red-faced cultivator said indifferently. There was not the slightest hint of pride or joy on his face. It was as if what he had just done was not an achievement at all. There was an indescribable sense of inevitability in his tone. Who is it? At this moment, an angry roar came from somewhere in the forbidden area. It came from outside the continent of the tall tower. The voice was crisp and sharp, and contained strong anger. It was Fairy Jiayu's voice. Obviously, the drastic changes that occurred in the forbidden area had caused the continent of the tall tower to shake. If it wasn't for Fairy Jiayu's careful protection, the continent of the tall tower might have already lost its balance and completely collapsed. Previously, Fairy Jiayu did not pay any attention to what was happening here and did not react to the attack on Luo Fan, because she was protecting the continent of the tall tower. But now, it was obvious that the continent of the tall tower had truly stabilized and was no longer as fragile as before. Only then did she have the mental energy to find trouble with the person who caused her trouble. "You're the wife of that puppy He Xian?" The cultivator with a dark red face sneered. At this moment, he traversed the void and directly appeared outside the continent of the tall tower, appearing in front of Fairy Jiayu. When Fairy Jiayu heard this, her eyes suddenly narrowed, and her pupils shrank to the size of a needle tip. "Who are you? What enmity do you have with my husband?" This sentence seemed to be spat out from the depths of hell, and it was extremely chilling. That He Xian was obviously Fairy Jiayu's husband, the young cultivator who sent down a wisp of aura from the 7th floor. Of course, the two words He Xian might be correct, and the puppy behind it was of course the cultivator with a dark red face, called him contemptuously. Chapter 25:33. Fairy Jiayu's face paled. A 7th tribulation cultivator was simply too powerful for her. Even if it was just a trace of his aura, it was already something she could not resist. More importantly, she began to worry about what had happened to her husband at this time. The fact that he and his son were in this place was not a secret, but it was not a public matter that was known to everyone. How did her husband's enemy know that she was here? Had something happened to her husband? Was he still alive? At this moment, all of this crazily emerged from the bottom of her heart, causing her to only feel that her mind had become chaotic. As a 6th tribulation cultivator, she was already far inferior to the 7th tribulation cultivator. At this moment, her mind was in a mess, and the gap between them naturally became wider. At this moment, the dark red cultivator's expression did not change at all. He raised his hand and gently patted toward Fairy Jiayu. Fairy Jiayu suddenly woke up as if she had just woken up from a dream. It was as if the pause button had been pressed on the entire forbidden area. Everything seemed to have come to a complete stop. Even the endless light that had the characteristics of the light of heaven and earth that filled the entire forbidden area was the same. Even the countless roots that extended from the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan used to connect the entire forbidden area were affected and began to tremble strangely. However, all of this was nothing to the cultivator with a dark red face. His hand did not slow down at all because of this. An unimaginably terrifying pressure instantly appeared in Fairy Jiayu's heart. This pressure was so great and so unstoppable. In an instant, it had already penetrated her entire body, inside and out, and even reached the source of her life, reaching the deepest mark of her life. It seemed like everything she had was about to be completely destroyed under this kind of pressure. At this moment, the dark red cultivator's expression froze slightly. The hand that was originally moving toward Fairy Jiayu also stopped in midair, unable to move an inch forward. "So it's here. I didn't expect that after this transformation, it could produce such a mysterious effect." At this moment, a voice that was extremely familiar to both Fairy Jiayu and the dark red cultivator appeared in their ears. "You're not dead." The dark red cultivator revealed a look of shock. At this moment, there was a soft pop and everything returned to normal. The dark red cultivator's palm completely collapsed, and all the mysterious power it contained disappeared in an instant. This slap looked like a casual, ordinary slap from an ordinary mortal. Even if it was an ordinary mortal, this kind of palm would only make them feel suffocated, let alone a 6th tribulation cultivator like Fairy Jiayu. At this moment, the endless light of heaven and earth seemed to blur a bit. Then, a figure appeared out of thin air not far from Fairy Jiayu and the dark red young man. This figure was elegant and indifferent, and there was not the slightest bit of aura coming from his body. However, he had a transcendent temperament. Although he was standing there, it was as if he was not in any space-time, world, or place. This figure was none other than Luo Fan. Although the dark red cultivator had completely erased everything about him in the real world, he was still only in the real world. For Luo Fan, who was connected to many realms, this kind of attack had no effect at all. He only needed a thought, and everything in the real world would be completely restored without a trace of damage. It was as if the attack from before had not landed on him at all. The reason why he waited until now and didn't appear the moment he was destroyed was naturally not because he was afraid of the dark red cultivator. Instead, it was because he felt something from the dark red cultivator's attack. This kind of subtle feeling could not be described with words. It was a kind of subtle transformation of the light of heaven and earth. During this transformation, the light of heaven and earth would turn into another form, and the various powers that existed within would be extracted and become his to control. In fact, this was similar to the route that the two balls of light in the final land of opportunity guided by the two balls of light, which had completely fused with the light of the world. However, the path that the two balls of light guided was completely integrated with the light of heaven and earth. It was as if the cultivator had completely given up on his independence. This kind of transformation was just to simulate some of the characteristics of the will of the world within the light of heaven and earth, and take the various subtle mysteries and principles within the light of heaven and earth as his own. The difference between the two was like one person transforming himself into a robot, while the other person transforming the robot into a mecha. The person would then sit inside the mecha and control the mecha. After leaving the mecha, the person would still be himself, still be flesh and blood, and still have the qualifications to grow and evolve. The difference between the two could be seen at a glance. Just now, the technique Luo Fan used was something he had comprehended from the technique displayed by the cultivator with a dark red complexion. It was a technique that was targeted at him. At this moment, the change of the roots of the light of heaven and earth was because some of its characteristics had been extracted by Luo Fan and taken by him. In a short period of time, these roots had to remain in this state. Only after a sufficient amount of time would these roots be able to recover from the self-circulation and once again become perfect and flawless. How could he be so strong? The dark red cultivator showed a look of disbelief. After all, he was a 7 tribulation expert from the 7th level of the road of Tao Master. His insight was naturally not comparable to that of an ordinary cultivator. When he saw the method that Luo Fan used, he already knew what Luo Fan had done. However, what surprised him was that the method that Luo Fan used was really too strong. Even though he was just an aura here, not a doppelganger, and not his real body. However, this aura alone was definitely above that of a 6 tribulations expert, let alone a cultivator on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. Normally, even if the other party had comprehended a key to transformation, it was absolutely impossible for him to have any effect on the method that he used, and it was impossible for him to block his attack. However, just now Luo Fan had turned the impossible into the possible. He had only just comprehended some of the key points, but he had already completely blocked his attack. This level of strength had obviously far exceeded his imagination. How could not be shocked? The foundation is still very important, Luo Fan said lightly. As he spoke, he raised his hand and slapped the cultivator in front of him. This slap no longer had any spiritual light, magic sense, and so on. It felt like such a casual slap of invisible power. Moreover, compared to the original countless spiritual lights, magic sense, and even the various grand and vast appearances of heaven and earth, this invisible power felt extremely small, even to the extent that even an individual immortal could ignore it. However, it was such an invisible power that the cultivator with a dark red face immediately changed his expression. His figure flashed, and he quickly retreated. At the same time, he raised his hand and drew a mysterious trajectory in front of him. As this trajectory followed, all kinds of indescribable changes appeared on his body. In a trance, countless indescribable strange space-times appeared in front of him out of thin air. These space-times were strange, as if they were overlapping, and there seemed to be some kind of strange and subtle dislocation, blocking the invisible power that Luo Fan slapped. The invisible power that Luo Fan slapped out had already permeated all aspects. It almost completely connected the countless overlapping dimensions, and it pounced at the opponent from each dimension. This was actually the mystery of the slap that the cultivator with a dark red face slapped out. The higher one's cultivation level was, the more idealistic one's nature became. Perhaps, for ordinary mortals, the world, the universe, and heaven and earth were all objective and could not be changed by one's will. However, as one's nature continued to improve with cultivation, this kind of objectivity would become lower and lower, and the influence of a cultivator's subjective cognition on the outside world would also become greater. At the level of a tribulation initiation powerhouse, as long as one had some cognition, they could almost derive the corresponding changes. At this moment, the method that Luo Fan used was similar to this. In this method, he divided the plane of reality into countless dimensions. Amongst them, the fleshly body resided in a dimension, magic treasures resided in another dimension, the light of the heavens and the earth resided in another dimension, the mind resided in another dimension, the soul resided in another dimension, the will resided in another dimension, and the source of life resided in another dimension. Just like this, countless dimensions overlapped together, and everything that existed in all the dimensions overlapped together to form the plane of reality. That was to say, a cultivator seemed to be the only one in front of him, but in fact he was a relatively independent entity that was formed by the overlapping of countless corresponding existences in countless dimensions. Under such circumstances, as long as his attack could be divided into countless dimensions, it would naturally be able to directly bypass all visible and invisible defenses and directly attack the cultivator's life, such as the origin of life, the mark of life, the spirit, and so on. After all, in their respective dimensions, they were completely exposed to the outside world. If the difference between the two was too great, this kind of attack would naturally not be effective. For example, if a false saint faced a tribulation initiation powerhouse, even if he knew this method, he would definitely not be able to cause any harm to him. After all, existences at the tribulation initiation level, even the weakest origin of life, was not something that a false saint could harm. Even with this kind of attack that could connect countless dimensions, it would be useless if the strongest attack could not even shake the weakest existence. However, if the difference between the two was not too great, the effect would be quite shocking. After all, when one cultivated to a certain realm, they could completely integrate everything in their body, perfectly connecting the strongest and weakest parts, causing even the weakest origin of life to have the same defensive ability as the strongest bones. However, ordinary cultivators' attacks did not just rely on the strength of their bodies and strength. Any cultivator, as long as they had a slight understanding of cultivation and combat, would generally use divine powers and magic arts that could greatly enhance their own strength to attack. Such an attack was obviously far beyond the defensive ability of strength and the body. If it was completely used on existences like the origin of life, it would not be difficult to destroy them. Not to mention, after reaching the 5th level of the Tao Master's Road and obtaining the light of heaven and earth, the cultivator's attack methods would be far better than their own. In terms of defense, although the light of heaven and earth also had an incredible defensive ability, if a direct attack and defense collided, it would naturally depend on the strength of the light of heaven and earth and the perfection of the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth. The result of the battle would not be one-sided. However, if an existence that could connect countless dimensions to attack had the light of heaven and earth, the result would obviously be different. With the attack power of the light of heaven and earth that was many times stronger than the cultivator's own, it could completely bypass the defense of the light of heaven and earth and directly attack the cultivator's body. Moreover, it was the weakest part. The effect was self-evident. However, this kind of attack was obviously not invincible. If one did not understand the nature of this attack and did not know that it was an attack through countless dimensions, he would naturally not be able to resist it. However, if one knew the nature of this attack, it was obviously not impossible to resist it, just like what the dark red cultivator was doing at this time. At this time, he directly poured his own defensive power into the countless dimensions, protecting himself in the countless dimensions at the same time, blocking the invisible force that was attacking him in these dimensions. At this moment, boom, 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 earth-shattering roars suddenly broke out, and the countless dimensions were instantly broken at this moment. A fog then appeared in front of the dark red cultivator. It seemed that Luo Fan's attack had been blocked.